Chapter 20 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 20. Star was very angry with Michael when he left her. There was perhaps more hurt pride and pique in her anger than she would have cared to own. He had failed to succumb to her charms. He had not seemed to notice her as other men did. He had even lost the look of admiration he used to wear when they were boy and girl. He had refused utterly to tell her what she had a great curiosity to know. She had been sure, was sure yet, that if Michael would tell her what he had against Stuyvesant Carter, she could explain it satisfactorily. Her flattered little head was almost turned at this time with the adoration she had received. She thought she knew almost everything that Stuyvesant Carter had ever done. He was a fluent talker, and had spent many hours detailing to her incidents and anecdotes of his eventful career. He had raced a good deal, and still had several expensive racing cars. There wasn't anything very dreadful about that, except, of course, it was dangerous. He used to gamble a great deal, but he had promised her he would never do it any more, because she thought it unrefined. Of course, it wasn't as though he hadn't plenty of money. And her mother had told her that all young men did those things. No, not her father, of course, for he had been unusual. But times were different nowadays. Young men were expected to be a little wild. It was the influence of college life and a progressive age, she supposed. It didn't do any harm. They always settled down and made good husbands after they were married. Michael, of course, did not understand these things. He had spent a great many years in Florida with a dear old professor and a lot of good little boys. Michael was unacquainted with the ways of the world. Thus she reasoned. Yet nevertheless Michael's warning troubled her, and finally she decided to go to the best source of information and ask the young man himself. Accordingly, 3 days after Michael's visit, when he dropped in to ask if she would go to the opera that evening with him, instead of something else they had planned to do together, she laughingly questioned him. "What in the world can you ever have done, Mr. Carter, that should make you unfit company for me?" She asked the question lightly, yet her eyes watched his face most closely as she waited for the answer. The blood rolled in dark waves over his handsome face, and his brows grew dark with anger which half hid the start of almost fear with which he regarded her. "What do you mean, Star?" He looked at her keenly, and could not tell if she were in earnest or not. "Just that," she mocked, half gravely. "Tell me what you have been doing that should make you unfit company for me. Someone has been trying to make me promise to have nothing to do with you, and I want to know what it means." "Who has been doing that?" There were dangerous lights in the dark eyes, lights that showed the brutality of the coward and the evildoer. "Oh, a man," said Star, provokingly. "But if you look like that, I shan't tell you anything more about it. I don't like you now. You look as if you could eat me. You make me think there must be something in it all." Quick to take the warning, the young man brought his face under control and broke into a hoarse, artificial laugh. A sudden vision of understanding had come to him, and a fear was in his heart. There was nothing like being bold and taking the bull by the horns. "I'll wager I can explain the riddle for you," he said airily. "I lost my way the other evening, coming home late. You see, there had been some mistake, and my car didn't come to the club for me. I started on foot, leaving word for it to overtake me." He lied as he went along. He had had a short lifetime of practice, and did it quite naturally and easily. "And I was thinking about you, and how soon I dared ask you a certain question, when all at once I noticed that things seemed sort of unfamiliar. I turned to go back, but couldn't for the life of me tell which way I had turned at the last corner. You see what a dangerous influence you have over me. And I wandered on, getting deeper and deeper into things. It wasn't exactly a savory neighborhood, and I wanted to get out as soon as possible, for I suspected that it wasn't even very safe down there alone at that hour of the night. I was hesitating under a streetlight, close to a dark alley, trying to decide which would be the quickest way out, and meditating what I should do to find a policeman, when suddenly there loomed up beside me in the dark, out of the depths of the alley, a great tall brute of a fellow, with the strangest looking yellow hair, and a body that looked as if he could play football with the universe if he liked, and charged me with having come down there to visit his girl. Well, of course, the situation wasn't very pleasant. I tried to explain that I was lost, that I had never been down in that quarter of the city before, and didn't even know his girl. But he would listen to nothing. He began to threaten me. Then I took out my card and handed it to him, most unwisely, of course, but then I am wholly unused to such situations. And I explained to him just who I was, and that of course I wouldn't want to come to see his girl, even if I would be so mean and all that. But do you believe me, that fellow wouldn't take a word of it. He threw the card on the sidewalk, ground his heel into it, and used all sorts of evil language that I can't repeat. And finally, after I thought he was going to put me in the ditch and pummel me, he let me go, shouting after me that if I ever came near his girl again, he would publish it in the newspapers. Then, of course, I understood what a foolish thing I had done in giving him my card. But it was too late. I told him as politely as I knew how that if he would show me the way to get home, I would never trouble him again, and he finally let me go. Star's eyes were all this time quizzically searching his face. Was the man intoxicated? She asked. Oh, I presume so, more or less. They all are down there, though he was not of the slums himself, I should say. He was rather well-dressed, and probably angry that I had discovered him in such haunts. When did this happen? About a week ago. Why didn't you tell me about it before? Oh, I didn't want to distress you, and besides, I've had my mind too full of other things. Star, darling, you must have seen all these weeks how much I love you, and how I have only been waiting the proper opportunity to ask you to be my wife. Star was, in a measure, prepared for this proposal. Her mother had instructed her that the alliance was one wholly within the pale of wisdom, and her own fancy was quite taken up with this handsome new admirer who flattered her hourly and showered attentions upon her until she felt quite content with herself, the world, and him. There was a spice of daring about Star that liked what she thought was the wildness and gaiety of young Carter, and she had quite made up her mind to accept him. 1 week later, the society papers announced the engagement, and the world of gaiety was all in a flutter over the many functions that were immediately set a-going in their honor. Michael, at his desk in the busy office, read and bowed his head in anguish. Star, his bright, beautiful Star, to be sacrificed to a beast like that. Would that he might once more save her to life and happiness. For the next few days, Michael went about in a state that almost bordered on the frantic. His white face looked drawn, and his great eyes burned in their clear setting like live coals. People turned to look after him on the street and exclaimed, "Why, look at that man!" And yet he seemed more like an avenging angel dropped down for some terrible errand than like a plain, ordinary man. Mr. Holt noticed it and spoke to him about it. "You ought to drop work and take a good vacation, Endicott," he said, kindly. "You're in bad shape. You'll break down and be ill. If I were in your place, I'd cancel the rent of that office and not try to start out for yourself until fall. It'll pay you in the end. You're taking things too seriously." But Michael smiled and shook his head. He was to open his own office the following week. It was all ready, with its simple furnishings, in marked contrast to the rooms that would have been his if he had acceded to his benefactor's request. But Michael had lost interest in office and work alike, and the room seemed now to him only a refuge from the eyes of men where he might hide with his great sorrow, and try to study out some way to save Star. Surely, her father would do something when he received his letter. It was long past time for an answer to have come. But then there was the hope that he was already doing something, though he was unwilling to afford Michael the satisfaction of knowing it. He gave much thought to a possible cablegram that he might send, that would tell the story to the father while telling nothing to the world, but abandoned the idea again and again. Sam came up from the farm and saw Michael's face and was worried. "Say, pard, what you been doing to yourself? Better come down to the farm and get a bit of fresh air." The only two people who did not notice the change in Michael's appearance were Hester and Will. They were too much engrossed in each other by this time to notice even Michael. They had fallen into the habit of leaving the rooms in the alley earlier than Michael, and going home by themselves. They left him thus one night about 3 weeks after Star's engagement had been announced. Michael stayed in the room for an hour after all the others had gone. He was expecting Sam to return. Sam had been up from the farm several times lately, and this time without any apparent reason he had lingered in the city. He had not been to the room that night, save for 10 minutes early in the evening, when he had mumbled something about a little business, and said he would be back before Michael left. Michael sat for a long time, his elbow on the table, his head in his hands, trying to think. A way had occurred to him which might or might not do something to prevent Star from throwing away her happiness. The morning paper had hinted that plans for a speedy wedding were on foot. It was rumored that Miss Endicott was to be married as soon as her father reached home. Michael was desperate. He feared that now the father would arrive too late for him to get speech with him. He had begun to know that it was hard to convince people of the evil of those they had chosen as friends. It would take time. There was a way. He might have the whole story published in the papers. A public scandal would doubtless delay, if not altogether put a stop to this alliance. But a public scandal that touched Mr. Carter would now also touch and bring into publicity the girl, whose life was almost linked with his. Not until the very last resort would Michael bring about that publicity. That such a move on his part would beget him the eternal enmity of the entire Endicott family, he did not doubt. But that factor figured not at all in Michael's calculations. He was not working for himself in this affair. Nothing that ever happened could make things right for him, he felt. And what was his life, or good name even, beside Star's happiness? Wearily at last, his problem unsolved, he got up and turned out the lights. As he was locking the door, his attention was arrested by two figures standing between himself and the streetlight at the end of the alley. It was a man and a woman, and the woman seemed to be clinging to the man and pleading with him. Such sights were not uncommon in the alley. Some poor woman often thus appealed to all that used to be good in the man she married, to make him stay away from the saloon, or to give her a little of his money to buy food for the children. More than once in such instances, Michael had been able successfully to add his influence to the wife's and get the man to go quietly home. He put the key hastily in his pocket and hurried toward the two. "You shan't! You shan't! You shan't never go back to her!" he heard the woman cry fiercely. "You promised me." "Shut up, will you? I don't care what I promised," said the man in a guarded voice that Michael felt sure he had heard before. "I shan't shut up. I'll holler if you go, so the police'll come. You've got a right to stay with me. You shan't do me no wrong, nor you shan't go back to that stuck-up piece. You're mine, I say, and you promised." With a curse, the man struck her a cruel blow across the mouth, and tried to tear her clinging hands away from his coat, but they only clung the more fiercely. Michael sprang to the woman's side like a panther. "Look out," he said in clear tones. "You can't strike a woman." His voice was low and calm, and sounded as it used to sound on the ball field when he was giving directions to his team at some crisis in the game. "Who says I can't?" snarled the man, and now Michael was sure he knew the voice. Then the wretch struck the woman between her eyes, and she fell heavily to the ground. Like a flash, Michael's great arm went out and felled the man, and in the same breath, from the shadows behind, there sprang out the slender, wiry figure of Sam, and flung itself upon the man on the ground, who, with angry imprecations, was trying to struggle to his feet. His hand had gone to an inner pocket as he fell, and in a moment more there was a flash of light, and Michael felt a bullet whiz by his ear. Nothing but the swerving of the straggling figures had saved it from going through his brain. It occurred to Michael in that instant that that was what had been intended. The conviction that the man had also recognized him gave strength to his arm as he wrenched the revolver from the hand of the would-be assassin. Nobody knew better than Michael how easy it would be to plead self-defense if the fellow got into any trouble. A man in young Carter's position, with wealth and friends galore, need not fear to wipe an unknown fellow out of existence. A fellow whose friends, with few exceptions, were toughs and jailbirds and ex-criminals of all sorts. It was just as he gave Carter's wrist the twist that sent the revolver clattering to the ground beside the unconscious woman, that Michael heard the hurried footsteps of the officer of the law, accompanied by a curious, motley crowd who had heard the pistol shot and come to see what new excitement life offered for their delectation. He suddenly realized how bad matters would look for Sam if he should be found in the embrace of one of society's pets, who would all too surely have a tale to tell that would clear himself regardless of others. Michael had no care for himself. The police all about that quarter knew him well and were acquainted with his work. They looked upon him with almost more respect than they gave the priests and deaconesses who went about their errands of mercy. For Michael's spirit look of being more than man, and the stories that were attached to his name in the alley, filled them with a worshipful awe. There was little likelihood of trouble for Michael with any of the officers, he knew. But Sam was another proposition. His life had not all been strictly virtuous in the past, and of late he had been away in New Jersey so much that he was little known, and would be at once suspected of having been the cause of the trouble. Besides, the woman lay unconscious at their feet. With a mighty effort, Michael now reached forth and plucked Sam, struggling fiercely, from the arms of his antagonist, and put him behind him in the doorway, standing firmly in front. Carter, thus released, sprawled for an instant in the road. Then, taking advantage of the momentary release, struggled to his feet and fled in the opposite direction from that in which the officers were approaching. "Let me go! I must get him!" muttered Sam, pushing fiercely to get by Michael. "No, Sam. Stay where you are and keep quiet. You'll gain nothing by running after him. You'll only get into trouble yourself." "I don't care," said Sam frantically. "I don't care what happens to me. I'll kill him. He stole my girl." But Michael stood before him like a wall of adamant in the strength that was his for the extremity. "Yes, Sam, my poor fellow, I know," said Michael gently, sadly. "I know, Sam. He stole mine, too." Sam subsided as if he had been struck, a low, awful curse upon his lips, his face pale and baleful. "You too?" The yearning tenderness went to Michael's heart like sweet salve, even in the stress of the moment. They were brothers in sorrow, and their brotherhood saved Sam from committing a crime. Then the police and crowd swept up, breathless. "What does all this mean?" panted a policeman, touching his cap respectfully to Michael. "Someone been shooting?" He stooped and peered into the white face of the still unconscious woman, and then looked suspiciously towards Sam, who was standing sullenly behind Michael. "He's all right," smiled Michael, throwing an arm across Sam's shoulder. "He only came in to help me when he saw I was having a hard time of it. The fellow made off in that direction." Michael pointed after Carter, whose form had disappeared in the darkness. "Any of the gang?" asked the officer as he hurried away. "No," said Michael. "He doesn't belong here." One officer hurried away, accompanied by a crowd. The other stayed to look after the woman. He touched the woman with his foot as he might have tapped a dying dog to see if there was still life there. A low growl like a fierce animal came from Sam's closed lips. Michael put a warning hand upon his arm. "Steady, Sam, steady," he murmured, and went himself and lifted the poor pretty head of the girl from its stony pillow. "I think you'd better send for the ambulance," he said to the officer. "She's had a heavy blow on her head. I arrived just in time to see the beginning of the trouble." "Ain't she dead?" said the officer indifferently. "Best get her into her house. Don't reckon they want to mess up the hospital with such cattle as this." Michael caught the fierce gleam in Sam's eyes. A second more would have seen the officer lying beside the girl in the road, and a double tragedy to the record of that night. For Sam was crouched and moving stealthily like a cat toward the officer's back, a look of almost insane fury upon his small, thin face. It was Michael's steady voice that recalled him to sanity once more. Just as many a time in the midst of a game, he had put self-control and courage into the hearts of his team. "Sam, could you come here and hold her head a minute while I try to get some water?" "Yes, officer, I think she is living, and she should be got to the hospital as soon as possible. Please give the call at once." The officer sauntered off to do his bidding. Michael and Sam began working over the unconscious girl, and the crowd stood idly round, waiting, until the ambulance rattled up. They watched with awe as the form of the woman was lifted in, and Michael and Sam climbed up on the front seat with the driver and rode away. Then they drifted away to their several beds, and the street settled into its brief night respite. The two young men waited at the hospital for an hour until a white-capped nurse came to tell them that Lizzie had recovered consciousness, and there was hope of her life. Then they went out into the late night together. "Sam, you're coming home with me tonight." Michael put his arm affectionately around Sam's shoulders. "You never would come before, but you must come tonight." And Sam, looking into the other's face for an instant, saw that in Michael's suffering eyes that made him yield. "I ain't fit," Sam murmured, as they walked along silently together. It was the first hint that Sam had ever given that he was not every whit as good as Michael. And Michael, with rare tact, had never by a glance let Sam know how much he wished to have him cleaner and more suitably garbed. "Oh, we'll make that all right," said Michael, fervently thankful that at last the time had come for the presentation of the neat and fitting garments which he had purchased some weeks before for a present for Sam, and which had been waiting for a suitable opportunity of presentation. The dawn was hovering in the east when Michael led Sam up to his own room, and throwing wide the door of his own little private bathroom, told Sam to take a hot bath. It would make him feel better. While Sam was thus engaged, Michael made a compact bundle of Sam's old garments, and stealing softly to the back hall window, landed them by a neat throw on the top of the ash barrel in the court below. Sam's clothes might see the alley again by way of the ash man, but never on Sam's back. Quite late that very same morning, when Sam, clothed and in a new and righter mind than ever before in his life, walked down with Michael to breakfast, and was introduced as my friend Mr. Casey to the landlady, who was hovering about the now deserted breakfast table, he looked every inch of him a respectable citizen. Not handsome and distinguished like Michael, of course, but quite unnoticeable, and altogether proper as a guest at the respectable breakfast table of Mrs. Semple. Michael explained that they had been detained out late the night before by an accident, and Mrs. Semple gave special orders for a nice breakfast to be served to Mr. Endicott and his friend, and said it wasn't any trouble at all. People always thought it was no trouble to do things for Michael. While they ate, Michael arranged with Sam to take a trip out to see Buck. "I was expecting to go this morning," he said. "I had my plans all made. They write me that Buck is getting uneasy, and they wish I'd come. But now," he looked meaningly at Sam, "I think I ought to stay here for a little. Could you go in my place? There are things here I must attend to." Sam looked, and his face grew dark with sympathy. He understood. "I'll keep you informed about Lizzie," went on Michael with delicate intuition. "And anyway, you couldn't see her for some time. I think if you try, you could help Buck as much as I. He needs to understand that breaking laws is all wrong, that it doesn't pay in the end, and that there has got to be a penalty. You know. You can make him see things in a new way if you try. Are you willing to go, Sam?" "I'll go," said Sam briefly, and Michael knew he would do his best. It might be that Sam's change of viewpoint would have more effect upon Buck than anything Michael could say. For it was an open secret between Sam and Michael now that Sam stood for a new order of things, and that the old life, so far as he was concerned, he had put away. And so Sam was got safely away from the danger spot, and Michael stayed to face his sorrow and the problem of how to save Star. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 21. The papers the next morning announced that Mr. Stuyvesant Carter, while taking a shortcut through the lower quarter of the city, had been cruelly attacked, beaten, and robbed, and had barely escaped with his life. He was lying in his rooms under the care of a trained nurse, and was recovering as rapidly as could be expected from the shock. Michael, reading it next morning, after seeing Sam off to Kansas, lifted his head with that quiet show of indignation. He knew that the message must have been telephoned to the paper by Carter himself, shortly after he had escaped from the police. He saw just how easy it was for him to give out any report he chose. Money and influence would buy even the public press. It would be little use to try to refute anything he chose to tell about himself. The days that followed were to Michael one long blur of trouble. He haunted Mr. Endicott's office in hopes of getting some news of his return, but they told him the last letters had been very uncertain. He might come quickly, and he might be delayed a month yet, or even longer, and a cablegram might not reach him much sooner than a letter, as he was traveling from place to place. After 3 days of this agony, knowing that the enemy would soon be recovering from his bruises and be out again, he reluctantly wrote a note to Starr. My dear Miss Endicott, at the risk of offending you, I feel that I must make one more attempt to save you from what I feel cannot but be great misery. The young man of whom we were speaking has twice, to my knowledge, visited a young woman of the slums within the last month, and has even, since your engagement, been maintaining an intimacy with her, which can be nothing but an insult to you. Though you may not believe me, it gives me greater pain to tell you this than anything I ever had to do before. I have tried in every way I know to communicate with your father, but have thus far failed. I am writing you thus, plainly and painfully, hoping that though you will not take my word for it, you will at least be willing to find some trustworthy, intimate friend of your family in whom you can confide, who will investigate this matter for you, and give you his candid opinion of the young man. I can furnish such a man with information as to where to go to get the facts. I know that what I have said is true. I beg for the sake of your future happiness that you will take means to discover for yourself. Faithfully yours, Michael. To this note, within 2 days, he received a condescending, patronizing reply. Michael, I am exceedingly sorry that you have lent yourself to means so low to accomplish your end, whatever that may be. It is beyond me to imagine what possible motive you can have for all this ridiculous calumny that you were trying to cast on one who has shown a most noble spirit toward you. Mr. Carter has fully explained to me his presence at the home of that girl, and because you seem to really believe what you have written me, and because I do not like to have anyone think evil of the man whom I am soon to marry, I am taking the trouble to explain to you. The young woman is a former maid of Mr. Carter's mother, and she is deeply attached to her. She does up Mrs. Carter's fine laces exquisitely, and Mr. Carter has twice been the bearer of laces to be laundered, because his mother was afraid to trust such valuable pieces to a servant. I hope you will now understand that the terrible things you have tried to say against Mr. Carter are utterly false. Such things are called blackmail, and bring terrible consequences in court, I am told, if they become known. So I must warn you never to do anything of this sort again. It is dangerous. If my father were at home, he would explain it to you. Of course, having been in that out-of-the-way Florida place for so long, you don't understand these things. But for Papa's sake, I would not like you to get into trouble in any way. There is one more thing I must say. Mr. Carter tells me that he saw you down in that questionable neighborhood, and that you are yourself interested in this girl. It seems strange when this is the case that you should have thought so ill of him. Trusting that you will cause me no further annoyance in this matter, S. D. Endicott. When Michael had read this, he bowed himself upon his desk as one who had been stricken unto death. To read such words from her whom he loved better than his own soul was terrible, and he might never let her know that these things that had been said of him were false. She would probably go always with the idea that his presence in that alley was a matter of shame to him. So far as his personal part in the danger to herself was concerned, he was from this time forth powerless to help her. If she thought such things of him, if she had really been made to believe them, then of course she could credit nothing he told her. Some higher power than his would have to save her, if she was to be saved. To do Starr justice, she had been very much stirred by Michael's note, and after a night of wakefulness and meditation, had taken the letter to her mother. Not that Star turned naturally to her most unnatural mother for help in personal matters, usually. But there seemed to be no one else to whom she could go. If only her father had been home. She thought of cabling him, but what could she say in a brief message? How could she make him understand? And then there was always the world standing by to peer curiously over one's shoulder when one sent a message. She could not hope to escape the public eye. She considered showing Michael's note to Morton, her faithful nurse, but Morton, wise in many things, would not understand this matter, and would be powerless to help her. So Star had gone to her mother. Mrs. Endicott, shrewd to perfection, masked her indignation under a very proper show of horror, told Star that of course it was not true, but equally of course it must be investigated, gave her word that she would do so immediately, and her daughter need have no further thought of the matter, sent at once for young Carter, with whom she held a brief consultation, at the end of which Star was called, and cheerfully given the version of the story which she had written to Michael. Stuyvesant Carter could be very alluring when he tried, and he chose to try. The stakes were a fortune, a noble name, and a very pretty girl with whom he was as much in love at present as he ever had been in his checkered career, with any girl. Moreover, he had a nature that held revenge long. He delighted to turn the story upon the man who pretended to be so righteous and who would dare to give him orders about a poor, worthless girl of the slums. He set his cunning intellect to devise a scheme whereby his adversary should be caught in his own net and brought low. He found a powerful ally in the mother of the girl he was to marry. For reasons of ambition, Mrs. Endicott desired supremely an alliance with the house of Carter, and she was most determined that nothing should upset her plans for her only daughter's marriage. She knew that if her husband should return and hear any hint of the story about Carter, he would at once put an end to any relations between him and Star. He had always been queer about such things, and particular, as she phrased it. It would be mortifying beyond anything to have any balk in the arrangements after things had gone thus far. And there was that hateful Mrs. Waterman, setting her cap for him so odiously everywhere, even since the engagement had been announced. Mrs. Endicott intended to risk nothing. Therefore she planned with the young people for an early marriage. She was anxious to have everything so thoroughly cut and dried, and matters gone so far that her husband could not possibly upset them when he returned. Finally, she cabled him, asking him to set a positive date for his homecoming, as the young people wished to arrange for an early wedding. He cabled back a date not so very far off, for in truth, though he had received none of Michael's warnings, he was uneasy about this matter of his daughter's engagement. Young Carter had of course seemed all right, and he saw no reason to demur when his wife wrote that the two young people had come to an understanding. But somehow it had not occurred to him that the marriage would be soon. He was troubled at thought of losing the one bright treasure of his home, when he had but just got her back again from her European education. He felt that it was unfortunate that imperative business had called him abroad, almost as soon as she returned. He was in haste to be back. But when his wife followed her cable message with a letter speaking of an immediate marriage and setting a date but 4 days after the time set for his arrival, he cabled to her to set no date until his return, which would be as soon as he could possibly come. However, Mrs. Endicott had planned well. The invitations had been sent out that morning. She thought it unnecessary to cable again, but wrote, "I'm sorry, but your message came too late. The invitations are all out now, and arrangements going forward. I knew you would not want to stop Star's plans, and she seems to have her heart set on being married at once. Dear Stuyvesant finds it imperative to take an ocean trip, and he cannot bear the thought of going without his wife. I really do not see how things could possibly be held off now. We should be the laughing-stock of society, and I am sure you would not want me to endure that. And Star, dear child, is quite childishly happy over her arrangements. She is only anxious to have you properly home in time, so do hurry and get an earlier boat, if possible. Over this letter Mr. Endicott frowned and looked troubled. His wife had ever taken things in her own hands where she would. But concerning Star they had never quite agreed, though he had let her have her own way about everything else. It was like her to get this marriage all fixed up while he was away. Of course it must be all right, but it was so sudden. And his little Star, his one little girl. Then, with his usual abrupt action, he put the letter in his inner pocket and proceeded to hurry his business as much as possible, that he might take an earlier boat than the one he had set. And he finally succeeded by dint of working night as well as day, and leaving several important matters to go as they would. The papers at last announced that Mr. Delavan Endicott, who had been abroad for 3 months on business, had sailed for home, and would reach New York nearly a week before the date set for the wedding. The papers were also filled with elaborate foreshadowings of what that event was likely to mean to the world of society. And Michael, knowing that he must drink every drop of his bitter cup, knowing that he must suffer and endure to the end of it, if perchance he might yet save her in some miraculous way, read every word, and knew the day and the hour of the boat's probable arrival. He had it all planned to meet that boat himself. If possible, he would go out on the Pilot and meet his man before he landed. Then the silence of the great deep fell about the traveler, and the days went by with the waiting one in the city. The preparations hurried forward by trained and skillful workers. The Endicott home was filled with comers and goers. Silks and satins and costly fabrics, laces and jewels and rare trimmings from all over the world were brought together by hands experienced in costuming the great of the earth. Over the busy machinery which she had set going, Mrs. Endicott presided with the calmness and positive determination of one who had a great purpose in view and meant to carry it out. Not a detail escaped her vigilant eye. Not an item was forgotten of all the millions of little necessities that the world expected, and she must have forthcoming. Nothing that could make the wedding unique, artistic, perfect, was too hard or too costly to be carried out. This was her pinnacle of opportunity to shine, and Mrs. Endicott intended to make the most of it. Not that she had not shone throughout her worldly career, but she knew that with the marriage of her daughter, her life would reach its zenith point, and must henceforth begin to decline. This event must be one to be remembered in the annals of the future, so long as New York should continue to marry and be given in marriage. Star's wedding must surpass all others in wonder and beauty and elegance. So she planned, wrought, carried out, and day by day the gleam in her eyes told that she was nearing her triumph. It did not disturb her when the steamer was overdue 1 whole day, and then 2. Star, even amid the round of gaieties in her young set, all given in her honor, found time to worry about her father. But the wife only found in this fact a cause for congratulation. She felt instinctively that her crucial time was coming when her husband reached home. If Michael had dared to carry out his threats, or if a breath of the stories concerning young Carter's life should reach him, there would be trouble against which she had no power. It was not until the 3rd morning, with still no news of the vessel, that Mrs. Endicott began to feel uneasy. It would be most awkward to have to put off the ceremony, and of course it would not do to have it without the bride's father, when he was hurrying to be present. If he would arrive just in time, so much the better, but late, that would be dreadful. She tightened her determined lips, and looked like a Napoleon saying to herself, "There shall be no Alps." In like manner she would have said, if she could, "There shall be no sea if I wish it." But the anxiety she felt was only manifested by her closer vigilance over her helpers, as swiftly and hourly the perfected preparations glided to their finish. Star grew nervous and restless and could not sleep, but hovered from room to room in the daytime, looking out of the windows, or fitfully telephoning the steamship company for news. Her fiancé found her most unsatisfactory, and none of the plans he proposed for her diversion pleased her. Dark rings appeared under her eyes, and she looked at him with a troubled expression sometimes, when she should have been laughing in the midst of a round of pleasures. Star deeply loved her father, and some vague presentiment of coming trouble seemed to shadow all the brightness of life. Now and then Michael's face, with its great, true eyes and pleading expression, came between her and Carter's face, and seemed to blur its handsome lines. And then indefinite questions haunted her. What if those terrible things Michael had said were true? Was she sure? Sure? And at times like that she fancied she saw a weakness in the lines about Carter's eyes and mouth. But she was most unused to studying character, poor child, and had no guide to help her in her lonely problem of choosing. For already she had learned that her mother's ways and hers were not the same. And her father did not come. When he came, it would be all right. It had to be, for there was no turning back, of course, now. The wedding was but 2 days off. Michael, in his new office, frankly acknowledged to himself these days that he could not work. He had done all that he could, and now was waiting for a report of that vessel. When it landed, he hoped to be the first man on board. In fact, he had made arrangement to go out to meet it before it landed. But it did not come. Was it going to be prevented until the day was put off? Would that make matters any better? Would he then have more time? And could he accomplish anything with Mr. Endicott, even supposing he had time? Was he not worse than foolish to try? Mr. Endicott was already angry with him for another reason. His wife and Star, and that scoundrel of a Carter, would tell all sorts of stories. Of course he would believe them in preference to his. He groaned aloud sometimes when he was alone in the office, and wished that there were but a way he could fling himself between Star and all evil once for all. Give his life for hers. Gladly, gladly would he do it, if it would do any good. Yet there was no way. And then there came news. The vessel had been heard from, still many miles out to sea, with one of her propellers broken, and laboring along at great disadvantage. But if all went well, she would reach her dock at noon of the following day, 8 hours before the time set for the wedding. Star heard, and her face blossomed into smiles. All would go well after all. She telephoned again to the steamship company a little while later, and her utmost fears were allayed by their assurances. Mrs. Endicott heard the news with intense relief. Her husband would scarcely have time to find out anything. She must take pains that he had no opportunity to see Michael before the ceremony. The young man heard, and his heart beat wildly. Would the time be long enough to save her? Noon of the next day came, but the steamer had not yet landed, though the news from her was good. She would be in before night. There was no doubt of it now. Mr. Endicott would be in time for the wedding, but just that, and no more. He had sent reassurances to his family, and they were going forward happily in the whirl of the last things. But Michael, in his lonely office, hung up the telephone receiver with a heavy heart. There would be no time now to save Star. Everything was against him. Even if he could get speech of Mr. Endicott, which was doubtful now, was it likely the man would listen at this the last minute? Of course his wife and daughter and her fiancé could easily persuade him all was well, and Michael a jealous fool. As he sat thus, with bowed head before his desk, he heard footsteps along the stone floor of the corridor outside. They halted at his door, and hesitating fingers fumbled with the knob. He looked up, frowning, and was about to send any chance client away, with the explanation that he was entirely too much occupied at present to be interrupted, when the face of the woman who opened the door caught his attention. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 22. It was Lizzie, with her baby in her arms. The girl he had defended in the alley, and whose face he had last seen lying white and unconscious in the moonlight, looking ghastly enough with the dark hair flung back against the harsh pillow of stone. The face was white now, but softened with the beauty of motherhood. The bold, handsome features had somehow taken on a touch of gentleness, though there glowed and burned in her dark eyes a fever of passion and unrest. She stood still for a moment, looking at Michael, after she had closed the door, and was holding the baby close, as if fearing there might be someone there who was minded to take it from her. As Michael watched her, fascinated, cut to the heart by the dumb suffering in her eyes, he was reminded of one of the exquisite Madonnas he had seen in an exhibition not long ago. The draperies had been dainty and cloud-like, and the face refined and wonderful in its beauty, but there had been the same sorrowful mother anguish in the eyes. It passed through his mind that this girl and he were kin because of a mutual torture. His face softened, and he felt a great pity for her swelling in his heart. His eyes wandered to the little upturned face of the baby, wrapped close in the shabby shawl against its mother's breast. It was a very beautiful little sleeping face, with the look still of the spirit world from which it had but recently come. There was something almost unearthly in its loveliness, appealing even in its sleep, with its innocent baby curves and outlines. A little stranger soul, whose untried feet had wandered into unwelcome quarters, where sorrows and temptations were so thickly strewn that it could not hope to escape them. What had the baby come for? To make one more of the swarming mass of sinful wretches who crowded the alley? Would those cherub lips, half parted now in a seraphic smile, live to pour forth blasphemous curses, as he had heard even very small children in the alley? Would that tiny seashell hand, resting so trustingly against the coarse cloth of its mother's raiment, looking like a rosebud gone astray, live to break open safes and take their contents? Would the lovely little soft round body, whose tender curves showed pitifully beneath the thin old shawl, grow up to lie in the gutter some day? The problem of the people had never come to Michael so forcibly, so terribly, as in that moment before Lizzie spoke. "Be you a real lawyer?" she asked. "Can you tell what the law is about folks and things?" Michael smiled and rose to give her a chair as courteously as though she had been a lady born. "Sit down," he said. "Yes, I am a lawyer. What can I do for you?" "I suppose you charge a lot," said the girl, with a meaning glance around the room. "You've got things fixed fine as silk here. But I'll pay anything you ask if it takes me a lifetime to do it, if you'll just tell me how I can get my rights." "Your rights?" questioned Michael, sadly. Poor child. Had she any rights in the universe that he could help her to get? The only rights he knew for such as she were room in a quiet graveyard, and a chance to be forgotten. "Say, ain't it against the law for a man to marry a woman when he's already got one wife?" "It is," said Michael, "unless he gets a divorce." "Well, I ain't going to give him no divorce, you bet," said the girl, fiercely. "I worked hard enough to get a real marriage, and I ain't going to give up to no fashionable swell. I'm as good as she is, and I've got my rights, and I'll have 'em. And besides, there's baby." Her face softened and took on a love light, and immediately Michael was reminded of the Madonna picture again. "I've got to think of him." Michael marveled to see that the girl was reveling in her possession of the little helpless burden who had been the cause of her sorrow. "Tell me about it." His voice was very gentle. He recalled suddenly that this was Sam's girl. Poor Sam, too. The world was a terribly tangled mess of trouble. "Well, there ain't much to tell that counts, only he kept company with me, and I wouldn't have anything else but a real marriage, and so he give in. And we had a couple of rooms in a real respectable house and had it fine till he had to go away on business, he said. I never believed that. Why, he was downright rich. He's a real swell, you know. What kind of business could he have?" Lizzie straightened herself proudly and held her head high. "About whom are you talking?" asked Michael. "Why, my husband, course, Mr. Stuyvesant Carter. You can see his name in the paper real often. He didn't want me to know his real name. He had me call him Dan Hunt for 2 months, but I caught on, and he was real mad for a while. He said his ma didn't like the match, and he didn't want folks to know he'd got married. It might hurt him with some of his swell friends." "You don't mean to tell me that Mr. Stuyvesant Carter ever really married you," said Michael, incredulously. "Sure," said Lizzie, proudly. "Married me just like any swell. Got me a diamond ring and a silk-lined suit and a willer plume and everything." Lizzie held up a grimy hand on which Michael saw a showy glitter of jewelry. "Have you anything to show for it?" asked Michael, expecting her, of course, to say no. "Have you any certificate or paper to prove that you were married, according to law?" "Sure," said Lizzie, triumphantly, drawing forth a crumpled roll from the folds of her dress and smoothing it out before his astonished eyes. There it was, a printed wedding certificate, done in blue and gold, with a colored picture of two clasped hands under a white dove, with a gold ring in its beak. Beneath was an idealized boat, with silken sails, bearing two people down a rose-lined river of life. And the whole was bordered with orange blossoms. It was one of those old-fashioned affairs that country ministers used to give their parishioners in the years gone by, and are still to be had in some dusty corners of a forgotten drawer in country bookstores. But Michael recognized at once that it was a real certificate. He read it carefully. The blanks were all filled in. The date she gave of the marriage was there, and the name of the bridegroom, though evidently written in a disguised hand, could be deciphered: Sty Carter. Michael did not recognize the names of either the witnesses or the officiating minister. "How do you happen to have Mr. Carter's real name here, when you say he married you under an assumed name?" he asked, moving his finger thoughtfully over the blurred name that had evidently been scratched out and written over again. "I made him put it in after I found out who he was," said Lizzie. "He couldn't come it over me that-a-way. He was awful gone on me then, and I could do most anything with him. It was 'fore she come home from Europe. She just went for him and turned his head. If I'd a knowed in time, I'd gone and told her, but land sakes, I don't s'pose 'twould have done much good. I would have been to her before, only I was fool enough to promise him I wouldn't say nothing to her if he'd keep away from her. You see, I needed money awful bad for baby. He don't take to living awful good. He cries a lot, and I bet to have thins for him. So I threatened him if he didn't do somepin' I'd go tell her. And he up and forked over, but not till I promised. But now they say the papers is tellin' he's to marry her tonight, and I gotta stop it somehow. I got my rights and babies to look after, promise or no promise. Can I get him arrested?" "I am not sure what you can do until I look into the matter," Michael said gravely. Would the paper he held help, or would it not, in his mission to Star's father? And would it be too late? His heavy heart could not answer. "Do you know these witnesses?" "Sure," said Lizzie, confidently. "They're all swells. They come down with him when he come to be married. I never seen him again, but they was real jolly and nice. They gave me a bouquet of real roses, and a bracelet made like a snake with green glass eyes." "And the minister? Which is his church?" "I'm sure I don't know," said Lizzie. "I never asked. He come along and was as jolly as any of 'em. He drank more'n all of 'em put together. He was awful game for a preacher." Michael's heart began to sink. Was this a genuine marriage after all? Could anything be proved? He questioned the girl carefully, and after a few minutes sent her on her way, promising to do all in his power to help her, and arranging to let her know as soon as possible if there was anything she could do. That was a busy afternoon for Michael. The arrival of the steamer was forgotten. His telephone rang vainly on his desk to a silent room. He was out tramping over the city in search of the witnesses and the minister who had signed Lizzie's marriage certificate. Meantime, the afternoon papers came out with a glowing account of the wedding that was to be, headed by the pictures of Star and Mr. Carter, for the wedding was a great event in society circles. Lizzie, on her hopeful way back to the alley, confident that Michael, the angel of the alley, would do something for her, heard the boys crying the afternoon edition of the paper, and was seized with a desire to see if her husband's picture would be in again. She could ill spare the penny from her scanty store that she spent for it. But then, what was money in a case like this? Michael would do something for her, and she would have more money. Besides, if worst came to worst, she would go to the fine lady and threaten to make it all public, and she would give her money. Lizzie had had more advantages than most of her class in the alley. She had worked in a seashore restaurant several summers and could read a little. From the newspaper account, she gathered enough to rouse her half-soothed frenzy. Her eyes flashed fire as she went about her dark little tenement room, making baby comfortable. His feeble wail and his sweet eyes looking into hers only fanned the fury of her flame. She determined not to wait for Michael, but to go on her own account at once to that girl that was stealing away her husband, her baby's father, and tell her what she was doing. With the cunning of her kind, Lizzie dressed herself in her best, a soiled pink silk shirtwaist with elbow sleeves, a spotted and torn black skirt that showed a tattered orange silk petticoat beneath its ungainly length, a wide white hat with soiled and draggled willow plume of Alice blue, and high-heeled pumps run over on their uppers. If she had but known it, she looked 10 times better in the old Madonna shawl she had worn to Michael's office. But she took great satisfaction in being able to dress appropriately when she went to the swells. The poor baby she wrapped in his soiled little best, and pinned a large untidy pink satin bow on the back of his dirty little blanket. Then she started on her mission. Now Star had just heard that her father's vessel would be at the dock in a trifle over an hour, and her heart was light and happy. Somehow all her misgivings seemed to flee away now that he was coming. She flew from one room to another like a wild bird, trilling snatches of song, and looking prettier than ever. "Oh, the wee sweet bairnie," murmured the old Scotch nurse. "If only her man would be good to her." There was some special bit of Star's attire for the evening that had not arrived. She was in a twitter of expectancy about it. To be sure, it pleased her, and when she heard the bell, she rushed to the head of the stairs and was halfway down to see if it had come, when the servant opened the door to Lizzie and her baby. 1 second more and the door would have closed hopelessly on poor Lizzie, for no servant in that house would have thought of admitting such a creature to the presence of their lady a few hours before her wedding. But Star, poised halfway on the landing, called, "What is it, Graves? Someone to see me?" "But she's not the sort of person—" "Miss Star," protested Graves, with the door only open a crack now. "Never mind, Graves, I'll see her for a minute. I can't deny anyone on my wedding day, you know, and Father almost safely here. Show her into the little reception room." She smiled a ravishing smile on the devoted Graves, so with many qualms of conscience and misgivings as to what the mistress would say if she found out. Graves ushered Lizzie and her baby to the room indicated, and Star fluttered down to see her. So it was Star's own doings that Lizzie came into her presence on that eventful afternoon. "Oh, what a sweet baby!" exclaimed Star, eagerly. "Is he yours?" Lizzie's fierce eyes softened. "Sit down and tell me who you are. Wait, I'll have some tea brought for you. You look tired. And won't you let me give that sweet baby a little white shawl of mine? I'm to be married tonight, and I'd like to give him a wedding present," she laughed gaily. And Morton was sent for the shawl, and another servant for the tea, while Star amused herself by making the baby crow at her. Lizzie sat in wonder. Almost for the moment she forgot her errand, watching this sweet girl in her lovely attire, making much of her baby. But when the tea had been brought, and the soft white wool shawl wrapped around the smiling baby, Star said again, "Now, please tell me who you are, and what you have come for. I can't give you but a minute or two more. This is a busy day, you know." Lizzie's brow darkened. "I'm Mrs. Carter," she said, drawing herself up with conscious pride. "Carter?" said Star, politely. "Yes, I'm the wife of the man you're going to marry tonight, and this is his child. I thought I'd come and tell you 'fore 'twas too late. I thought if you had any goodness in you, you'd put a stop to this and give me my rights, and you seem to have some heart. Can you call it off? You wouldn't want to take my husband away from me, would you? You can get plenty others, and I'm just a plain working girl, and he's mine anyhow, and this is his kid." Star had started to her feet, her eyes wide, her hand fluttering to her heart. "Stop!" she cried. "You must be crazy to say such things. My poor girl, you have made a great mistake. Your husband is some other Mr. Carter, I suppose. My Mr. Carter is not that kind of a man. He has never been married." "Yes, he has," interposed Lizzie, fiercely. "He's married, all right, and I got the certificate all right, too. Only I couldn't bring it this time, because I left it with my lawyer. But you can see it if you want to, with his name all straight, Stuyvesant and Carter, all writ out. I see to it that he writ it himself. I can read myself pretty good, so I knowed." "I am very sorry for you," said Star sweetly, though her heart was beating violently in spite of her efforts to be calm, and to tell herself that she must get rid of this wretched impostor without making a scene for the servants to witness. "I'm very sorry, but you have made some great mistake. There isn't anything I can do for you now, but later, when I come back to New York, if you care to look me up, I will try to do something for baby." Lizzie stood erect in the middle of the little room, her face slowly changing to a stony stare, her eyes fairly blazing with anger. "Do you mean to tell me you're going to go on and marry my husband just as if nothing had happened? Ain't you going to ask him if it's true nor nothing? Ain't you going to find out what's true about him? Or do you want him so bad you don't care who you hurt, or what he is, so long's he make a big splurge before folks? Ain't you going to ask him about it?" "Oh, why, certainly, of course," said Star, as if she were pacifying a frantic child. "I can ask him. I will ask him, of course, but I know that you are mistaken. Now, really, I shall have to say good afternoon. I haven't another minute to spare. You must go." "I shan't stir a step till you promise me that you'll ask him right straight away. Ain't you all got no telephone? Well, you can call him up and ask him. Just ask him why he didn't ever speak to you of his wife Lizzie, and where he was the evening of August 4. That's the date on the certificate. Tell him you've seen me, and then see what he says. Tell him my lawyer is going to fix him if he goes on. It'll be in all the papers tomorrow morning if he goes on. And you can say I shan't never consent to no divorce. They ain't respectable, and I got to think of that on baby's account." "If you will go quietly away now, and say nothing more about this to anyone, I will tell Mr. Carter all about you," said Star, her voice trembling with the effort at self-control. "Do you promise you will?" "Certainly," said Star with dignity. "Will you do it right off straight?" "Yes, if you will go at once." "Cross your heart?" "What?" "Cross your heart you will? That's a sort of oath to make you keep your promise," explained Lizzie. "A lady needs no such thing to make her keep her promise. Don't you know that ladies always keep their promises?" "I wasn't so sure," said Lizzie. "You can't most always tell. 'Tis best to be on the safe side. Will you promise me you won't marry him if you find out he's my husband?" "Most certainly I will not marry him if he is already married. Now go, please, at once. I haven't a minute to spare. If you don't go at once, I cannot have time to call him up." "You sure I can trust you?" Star turned on the girl such a gaze of mingled dignity and indignation that her eye quailed before it. "Well, I suppose I gotta," she said, dropping her eyes before Star's righteous wrath. "But no wedding bells for you tonight if you keep your promise. So long." Star shuddered as the girl passed her. The whiff of unwashed garments, stale cooking, and undefinable tenement odor that reached her nostrils sickened her. Was it possible that she must let this creature have a hold, even momentarily, upon her last few hours? Yet she knew she must. She knew she would not rest until she had been reassured by Carter's voice, and the explanation that he would surely give her. She rushed upstairs to her own private phone, locking the door on even her old nurse, and called up the phone in Carter's private apartments. Without owning it to herself, she had been a little troubled all the afternoon because she had not heard from Carter. Her flowers had come, magnificent in their costliness and arrangement, and everything he was to attend to was done, she knew. But no word had come from himself. It was unlike him. She knew that he had given a dinner the evening before to his old friends who were to be his ushers, and that the festivities would have lasted late. He had not probably arisen very early, of course, but it was drawing on toward the hour of the wedding now. She intended to begin to dress at once, after she had phoned him. It was strange she had not heard from him. After much delay, an unknown voice answered the phone, and told her Mr. Carter could not come now. She asked who it was, but got no response, except that Mr. Carter couldn't come now. The voice had a muffled, thick sound. "Tell him to call me then, as soon as possible," she said, and the voice answered, "All right." Reluctantly, she hung up the receiver and called Morton to help her dress. She would have liked to get the matter out of the way before she went about the pretty ceremony, and submitted herself to her nurse's hands with an ill grace and troubled thoughts. The coarse beauty of Lizzie's face haunted her. It reminded her of an actress that Carter had once openly admired, and she had secretly disliked. She found herself shuddering inwardly every time she recalled Lizzie's harsh voice and uncouth sentences. She paid little heed to the dressing process, after all, and let Morton have her way in everything, starting nervously when the phone bell rang or anyone tapped at her door. A message came from her father, finally. He hoped to be with her in less than an hour now, and as yet no word had come from Carter. Why did he not know she would be anxious? What could have kept him from his usual greeting of her, and on their wedding day? Suddenly, in the midst of Morton's careful draping of the wedding veil, which she was trying in various ways to see just how it should be put on at the last minute, Starr started up from her chair. "I cannot stand this, Morty. That will do for now. I must telephone Mr. Carter. I can't understand why he doesn't call me." "Oh, but the poor man is that busy," murmured Morton, excusingly, as she hurried obediently out of the room. "Now mind you don't muss that beautiful veil." But after a half-hour of futile attempt to get into communication with Carter, Starr suddenly appeared in her door, calling for her faithful nurse again. "Morty," she called excitedly, "come here quick. I've ordered the electric. It's at the door now. Put on your big cloak and come with me. I've got to see Mr. Carter at once, and I can't get him on the phone." "But, Miss Starr," protested Morton, "you've no time to go anywhere now, and look at your pretty veil." "Never mind the veil, Morty. I'm going. Hurry. I can't stop to explain. I'll tell you on the way. We'll be back before anyone has missed us." "But your mamma, Miss Starr, she'll be very angry with me." "Mamma must not know. And anyway, I must go. Come. If you won't come with me, I'm going alone." Starr, with these words, grasped a great cloak of dark green velvet, soft and pliable as a skin of fur, threw it over her white bridal robes, and hurried down the stairs. "Oh, Miss Starr, darlin'," moaned Morton, looking hurriedly around for a cloak with which to follow. "You'll spoil your veil, sure. Wait till I take it off'n you." But Starr had opened the front door, and was already getting into the great luxurious car that stood outside. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Lowell Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 23. Michael, as he went about on his search, kept crying over and over again in his heart, "Oh, God, do something to save her. Do something to save my little Starr." Over and over the prayer prayed itself, without seeming thought or volition on his part, as he went from place to place, faithfully, keenly, step by step, searching out what he needed to know. At last, toward 6 o'clock, his chain of evidence led him to the door of Stuyvesant Carter's apartments. After some delay, the door was opened, reluctantly, a little way, by a servant with an immobile mask of a face, who stared at him stupidly, but finally admitted that the 3 men whose names he mentioned were inside. He also said that Mr. Carter was in, but could not be seen. He closed the door on the visitor, and went inside again to see if any of the others would come out. There ensued an altercation in loud and somewhat unsteady tones, and at last the door opened again, and a fast-looking young man, who admitted himself to be Theodore Brooks, slid out and closed it carefully behind him. The air that came with him was thick with tobacco smoke and heavy with liquor, and the one glimpse Michael got of the room showed a strange radiance of some peculiar light that glowed into the dusky hall weirdly. The heavy-eyed youth who stood braced against the wall uncertainly looked into Michael's face with an impudent laugh. "Well, parson, what's the grouch? Are you the devil or an angel sent to bring retribution?" He ended with a silly laugh that told the experienced ear of the young lawyer that the young man had been drinking heavily. And this was the man whose name was signed as Reverend Theodore Brooks, D.D., on the tawdry little marriage certificate that Michael held in his hand. His heart sank at the futility of the task before him. "Are you a minister?" asked Michael briefly. "Am I a minister?" drawled young Brooks. "My minster? Well, now that gets my goat. Say, boys, he wants to know if I'm a minster. Minster of what? Minster Plamperton Cherry?" "Did you ever perform a marriage?" asked Michael sharply, to stop the loud guffaw that was re-echoing through the polished corridors of the apartment. "Perform a marriage, d'ye say? No, but I'm going to perform to marriage tonight, if the dad wakes up in time. Going to be best man. Say, boys, got him awake yet? Getting late." Michael, in despair, took hold of the other's arm and tried to explain what he wanted to know. Finally, he succeeded in bringing the matter into the fellow's comprehension. "Wedding. Oh, yes, I remember. Peach of a girl. Stovey awfully fond of her. No harm meant. Good joke. Yes, I borrowed Grandfather Brooks's old gown and bands. Awfully good disguise. No harm meant. Only good joke. Girl awfully set on getting married. Stovey wanted to please her. Awfully good joke." "A ghastly joke, I should say, sir," said Michael sternly, and then the door was flung open by hands from inside, loud, angry voices protesting, while another hand sought unavailingly to close the door again. But Michael came and planted himself in the open door, and stood like an avenging angel come to call to judgment. The scene that was revealed to him was too horrifying for words. A long banquet table stood in the midst of the handsome room, whose furnishings were of the costliest. Amid the scattered remains of the feast, napkins lying under the table, upset glasses still dripping their ruby contents down the damask of the tablecloth, broken china, scattered plates and silver, stood a handsome silver-bound coffin, within which, pallid and deathlike, lay the handsome form of the bridegroom of the evening. All about the casket in high sconces burned tall tapers, casting their spectral light over the scene. Distributed about the room, lounging in chairs, fast asleep on the couches, lying under the table, fighting by the doorway, one standing on a velvet chair, raising an unsteady glass of wine, and making a flabby attempt at a drinking song, were 10 young men, the flower of society, the expected ushers of the evening's wedding. Michael, with his white face, his golden hair aflame in the flickering candlelight, his eyes full of shocked indignation, stood for a moment surveying the scene, and all at once he knew that his prayer was answered. There would be no wedding that night. "Is this another of your ghastly jokes?" He turned to Brooks, who stood by as master of ceremonies, not in the least disturbed by the presence of the stranger. "That's just what it is," stuttered Brooks. "A joke. A practical joke. No harm meant, only Stovey's hard to wake up. Never did like getting up in the morning. Wake 'em up, boys, wake 'em up. Time to get dressed for the wedding." "Has anyone sent word to Miss Endicott?" "Sent word to Miss Endicott? No, I knows they have. Think she'd care to come? Say, boys, that's a good joke. This old fellow don't know who he is. Devil and all his angels, perhaps. He suggests we send word to Miss Endicott to come to the funeral." "I said nothing of the kind," said Michael, fiercely. "Have you no sense of decency? Go and wash your face, and try to realize what you've been doing. Have someone telephone for a doctor. I will go and tell the family." And Michael strode out of the room to perform the hardest task that had ever yet fallen to his lot. He did not wait for the elevator, but ran down the flights of stairs, trying to steady his thoughts and realize the horror through which he had just passed. As he started down the last flight, he heard the elevator door clang below, and as it shot past him, he caught a glimpse of white garments and a face with eyes that he knew. He stopped short and looked upward. Could it be? But no, of course not. He was foolish. He turned and compelled his feet to hurry down the rest of the stairs. But at the door, his worst fears were confirmed. For there stood the great electric car, and the familiar face of the Endicott chauffeur assured him that someone of the family had just gone to the ghastly spectacle upstairs. In sudden panic, he turned and fled up the stairs. He could not wait for elevators now. He fain would have had wings, the wings of a protecting angel, that he might reach her ere she saw that sight of horror. Yet even as he started, he knew that he must be too late. Starr stopped, startled, in the open doorway, with Morton, protesting, apprehensive, just behind her. The soft cloak slid away from her, down the satin of her gown, and left her revealed in all her wedding whiteness, her eyes like stars, her beautiful face flushed excitedly. Then the eyes rested on the coffin and its death-like occupant, and her face went white as her dress, while a great horror grew in her eyes. Brooks, more nearly sober than the rest, saw her first, and hastened to do the honors. "Say, boys, she's come," he shouted. "Bride's come. Get up, Bobby Trascom. Don't you know you mustn't lie down when there's a lady present? Van, get out from under that table. Help me pick up these things. Place all in a mess. Glad to see you, Miss Endicott." He bowed low and staggered as he recovered himself. Star turned her white face toward him. "Mr. Brooks," she said, in a tone that sobered him somewhat. "What does it mean? Is he dead?" Not at all, Miss Endicott," he tried to say, gravely. "Have him all right in plenty time. Just a little joke, Miss Endicott. He's merely slightly intoxicated." But Star heard no more. With a little stifled cry and a groping motion of her white-clad arms, she crumpled into a white heap at the feet of her horrified nurse. It was just as she fell that Michael appeared at the door, like the rescuing angel that he was, and with one withering glance at the huddled group of men, he gathered her in his arms and sped down the stairs, faithful Morton puffing after him. Neither of them noticed a man who got out of the elevator just before Star fell, and walking rapidly toward the open door, saw the whole action. In a moment more, Mr. Endicott stood in the door, surveying the scene before him with stern, wrathful countenance. Like a dash of cold water, his appearance brought several of the participants in the disgraceful scene to their senses. A few questions, and he was possessed of the whole shameful story. The stag dinner growing into a midnight orgy, the foolish dare, and the reckless acceptance of it by the already intoxicated bridegroom, the drugged drinks, and the practical joke carried out by brains long under the influence of liquor. Carter's man, who had protested, had been bound and gagged in the back room. The jokers had found no trouble in securing the necessary tools to carry out their joke. Money will buy anything, even an undertaker for a living man. The promise of secrecy and generous fees brought all they needed. Then, when the ghastly work was completed, and the unconscious bridegroom lying in state in his coffin, amid the debris of the table, they drowned the horror of their deed in deeper drinking. Mr. Endicott turned from the scene, his soul filled with loathing and horror. He had reached home to find the house in a tumult and Star gone. Morton, as she went out the door after her young mistress, had whispered to the butler their destination, and that they would return at once. She had an innate suspicion that it would be best for someone to know. Mr. Endicott at once ordered the runabout and hastened after them, arriving but a moment or two later. Michael had just vanished up the apartment stairs as he entered the lower hallway. The vague, indefinite trouble that had filled his mind concerning his daughter's marriage to a man he little knew except by reputation crystallized into trouble, dear and distinct, as he hurried after his daughter. Something terrible must have come to Star, or she would never have hurried away, practically alone at a time like this. The electric car was gone by the time Mr. Endicott reached the lower hall again, and he was forced to go back alone as he came, without further explanation of the affair than what he could see. But he had time in the rapid trip to become profoundly thankful that the disgraceful scene he had just left had occurred before and not after his daughter's marriage. Whatever alleviating circumstances there were to excuse the reckless victim of his comrade's joke, the fact remained that a man who could fall victim to a joke like that was not the companion for his daughter's life. She who had been shielded and guarded at every possible point, and loved as the very apple of his eye. His feelings toward the perpetrators of this gruesome sport were such that he dared not think about them yet. No punishment seemed too great for such. And she, his little Star, had looked upon that shameful scene, had seen the man she was expecting to marry lying as one dead. It was too awful. And what had it done to her? Had it killed her? Had the shock unsettled her mind? The journey to his home seemed longer than his whole ocean voyage. Oh, why had he not left business to go to the winds, and come back long ago to shield his little girl? Meantime, Michael, his precious burden in his arms, had stepped into the waiting car, motioning Morton to follow and sit in the opposite seat. The delicate Paris frock trailed unnoticed underfoot, and the rare lace of the veil fell back from the white face. But neither Michael nor the nurse thought of satin and lace now, as they bent anxiously above the girl to see if she still breathed. All the way to her home, Michael held the lovely little bride in his arms, feeling her weight no more than a feather, fervently thankful that he might bear her thus for the moment, away from the danger that had threatened her life. He wished with all his heart he might carry her so to the ends of the earth and never stop until he had her safe from all harm that earth could bring. His heart thrilled wildly with the touch of her frail sweetness, even while his anxious face bent over her to watch for signs of returning consciousness. But she did not become conscious before she reached the house. His strong arms held her as gently as though she had been a baby, as he stepped carefully out and carried her to her own room, laying her upon the white bed, where but 2 hours before the delicate wedding garments had been spread, ready for her to put on. Then he stood back, reverently looked upon her dear face, and turned away. It was in the hall that he met her mother, and her face was fairly disfigured with her sudden recognition of him. "What? Is it you that have dared come into this house? The impertinence! I shall report all your doings to my husband. He will be very angry. I believe that you are at the bottom of this whole business. You shall certainly be dealt with as you deserve." She hissed the words after him as Michael descended the stairs with bowed head and closed lips. It mattered not now what she said or thought of him. Starr was saved. He was about to pass out into the world again, away from her, away even from knowledge of how she came out of her swoon. He had no further right there now. His duty was done. He had been allowed to save her in her extremity. But just as he reached it, the door opened, and Mr. Endicott hurried in. He paused for an instant. "Son," said he, "it was you who brought her home." It was as if that conviction had but just been revealed to his perturbed mind. "Son, I'm obliged. Sit here till I come. I want to speak with you." The doctor came with a nurse, and Michael sat and listened to the distant voices in her room. He gathered from the sounds by and by that Starr was conscious, was better. Until then no one had thought of the wedding, or of the waiting guests that would be gathering. Something must be done. And so it came about that as the great organ sounded forth the first notes of the wedding march, for by some blunder the bride's signal had been given to the organist when the Endicott car drew up at the church, that Michael, bareheaded, with his hat in his hand, walked gravely up the aisle, unconscious of the battery of eyes, and astonished whispers of, "Who is he? Isn't he magnificent? What does it mean? I thought the ushers were to come first?" Until he stood calmly in the chancel and faced the wondering audience. If an angel had come straight down from heaven and interfered with their wedding, they could not have been more astonished. For, as he stood beneath the many soft lights in front of the wall of living green and blossoms, with his white face and grave, sweet dignity, they forgot for once to study the fashion of his coat, and sat awed before his beautiful face. For Michael wore tonight the look of transport, with chin uplifted, glowing eyes, and countenance that showed the spirit shining through. The organist looked down and instinctively hushed his music. Had he made some mistake? Then Michael spoke. Doubtless he should have gone to the minister who was to perform the ceremony, and given him the message. But Michael little knew the ways of weddings. It was the first one he had ever attended, and he went straight to the point. "On account of the sudden and serious illness of the groom," he said, "it will be impossible for the ceremony to go on at this time. The bride's family ask that you will kindly excuse them from further intrusion or explanation this evening." With a slight inclination of his head to the breathless audience, Michael passed swiftly down the aisle and out into the night, and the organist, by tremendous self-control, kept on playing softly until the excited people, who had drifted usherless into the church, got themselves out into their carriages once more. Michael walked out into the night, bareheaded still, his eyes lifted to the stars shining so far away above the city, and said softly, with wondering, reverent voice, "Oh God! Oh God!" End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 24. Following hard upon the interrupted wedding came other events that not only helped to hush matters up, but gave the world a plausible reason why the ceremony did not come off as soon as the groom was convalescent, from what was reported in the papers to be an attack of acute indigestion, easily accounted for by the round of banquets and entertainments which usually precede a society wedding. During that eventful night, while Star still lay like a crushed lily torn rudely from its stem, her mother, after a stormy scene with her husband, in which he made it plain to her just what kind of a man she was wanting her daughter to marry, and during which she saw the fall of her greatest social ambitions, was suddenly stricken with apoplexy. The papers next morning told the news as sympathetically as a paper can tell one's innermost secrets. It praised the wonderful ability of the woman who had so successfully completed all the unique arrangements for what had promised to be the greatest wedding of the season, if not of all seasons, and upon whose overtaxed strength the last straw had been laid in the illness of the bridegroom. It stated that now, of course, the wedding would be put off indefinitely, as nothing could be thought of while the bride's mother lay in so critical a state. For a week there were daily bulletins of her condition published always in more and more remote corners of the paper, until the little ripple that had been made in the stream of life passed, and no further mention was made of the matter, save occasionally when they sent for some famous specialist, when they took her to the shore to try what sea air might do, or when they brought her home again. But all the time the woman lay locked in rigid silence. Only her cold eyes followed whoever came into her room. She gave no sign of knowing what they said, or of caring who came near her. Her husband's earnest pleas, Star's tears, drew from her no faintest expression that might have been even imagined from a fluttering eyelash. There was nothing but that stony stare, that almost unseeing gaze, that yet followed wherever one would move. It was a living death. And when one day the release came, and the eyes were closed forever from the scenes of this world, it was a sad relief to both husband and daughter. Star and her father stole away to an old New England farmhouse, where Mr. Endicott's elderly maiden sister still lived in the old family homestead. A mild-eyed, low-voiced woman, with plain gray frocks and soft white laces at wrists and neck and ruched about her sweet old face above the silver of her hair. Star had not been there since she was a little child, and her sad heart found her aunt's home restful. She stayed there through the fall and until after the first of the year, while her father came and went as business dictated, and the Endicott home on Madison Avenue remained closed except for the caretakers. Meanwhile, young Carter had discreetly escorted his mother to Europe, and was supposed by the papers to be going to return almost immediately. Not a breath of gossip, strange to say, stole forth. Everything seemed arranged to quiet any suspicion that might arise. Early in the fall he returned to town, but Star was still in New England. No one knew of the estrangement between them. Their immediate friends were away from town still, and everything seemed perfectly natural in the order of decency. Of course, people could not be married at once when there had been a death in the family. No one but the two families knew of Carter's repeated attempts to be reconciled to Star, of his feeble endeavor at explanation, of her continued refusal even to see him, and the decided letter she wrote him after he had written her the most abject apology he knew how to frame. Nor of her father's interview with the young man, wherein he was told some facts about himself more plainly than anyone, even in his babyhood, had ever dared to tell him. Mr. Endicott agreed to keep silence for Star's sake, provided the young man would do nothing to create any gossip about the matter, until the intended wedding had been forgotten, and other events should have taken the minds of society from their particular case. Carter, for his own sake, had not cared to have the story get abroad, and had sullenly acceded to the command. He had not, however, thought it necessary to make himself entirely miserable while abroad, and there were those who more than once spoke his name in company with that of a young and dashing divorcee. Some even thought he returned to America sooner than he intended, in order to travel on the same steamer that she was to take. However, those whispers had not as yet crossed the water, and even if they had, such things were too common to cause much comment. Then one Monday morning, the papers were filled with horror over an unusually terrible automobile accident, in which a party of 7, of whom the young divorcee was one and Stuyvesant Carter was another, went over an embankment 60 feet in height, the car landing upside down on the rocks below, and killing every member of the party. The paper also stated that Mr. Theodore Brooks, intimate friend of Carter's, who was to have been best man at the wedding some months previous, which was postponed on account of the sudden illness and death of the bride's mother, was of the party. Thus ended the career of Stuyvesant Carter, and thus the world never knew exactly why Star Endicott did not become Mrs. Carter. Michael, from the moment that he went forth from delivering his message in the church, saw no more of the Endicotts. He longed inexpressibly to call and inquire for Star, to get some word of reconciliation from her father, to ask if there was not some little thing that he might be trusted to do for them. But he knew that his place was not there, and his company was not desired. Neither would he write, for even a note from him could but seem, to Star, a reminder of the terrible things of which he had been witness, that is, if anybody had ever told her it was he that brought her home. One solace alone he allowed himself. Night after night, as he went home late, he would walk far out of his way to pass the house and look up at her window. And always it comforted him a little to see the dim radiance of her soft night-light. Behind the draperies of those windows, somewhere safe, she lay asleep, the dear little white-faced girl that he had been permitted to carry to her home and safety, when she had almost reached the brink of destruction. About a week after the fateful wedding day, Michael received a brief note from Star. My dear Mr. Endicott, I wish to thank you for your trouble in bringing me home last week. I cannot understand how you came to be there at that time. Also, I am deeply grateful for your kindness in making the announcement at the church. Very sincerely, S.D.E. Michael felt the covert question in that phrase. I cannot understand how you came to be there at that time. She thought, perhaps, that to carry his point and stop the marriage he had had a hand in that miserable business. Well, let her think it. It was not his place to explain, and really, of course, it could make little difference to her what she believed about him. As well to let it rest. He belonged out of her world, and never would he try to force his way into it. And so, with the whiteness of his face still lingering from the hard days of tension, Michael went on, straining every nerve in his work, keeping the alley room open nightly, even during hot weather, and in constant touch with the farm, which was now fairly on its feet and almost beginning to earn its own living, though the contributions still kept coming to him quietly, here and there, and helped in the many new plans that grew out of the many new necessities. The carpenter had built and built, until there were pretty little bungalows of 1 and 2 and 3 rooms dotted all about the farm, to be rented at a low price to the workers. It had come to be a little community by itself, spoken of as Old Orchard Farms, and well respected in the neighborhood, for in truth the motley company that Michael and Sam gathered there had done far better in the way of law and orderliness than either had hoped. They seemed to have a pride that nothing that could hurt the boss's reputation as a landowner should be laid to their charge. If by chance there came into their midst any sordid being who could not see matters in that light, the rest promptly taught him better, or else put him out. And now the whole front yard was aflame with brilliant flowers in their season. The orchard had been pruned and trimmed and grafted, and in the spring presented a foreground of wonderful pink and white splendor. And at all seasons of the year the grassy drive wound its way up to the old house, through a vista of branches, green or brown. It had long been in Michael's heart to build over the old house, for what he did not know. Certainly he had no hope of ever using it himself except as a transitory dwelling. Yet it pleased his fancy to have it as he dreamed it out. Perhaps some day it might be needed for some supreme reason, and now was the time to get it ready. So one day he took a great and simple-hearted architect down to the place to stay overnight and get an idea of the surroundings. And a few weeks later he was in possession of a plan that showed how the old house could be made into a beautiful new house, and yet keep all the original outlines. The carpenter, pleased with the prospect of doing something really fine, had undertaken the work, and it was going forward rapidly. The main walls were to be built around with stone, old stone bought from the ruins of a desolated barn of forgotten years, stone that was rusty and golden and green in lovely mellow tones, stone that was gray with age and mossy in place, now and then a stone that was dead black to give strength to the coloring of the whole. There were to be windows everywhere, wide, low windows that would let the sunlight in, and windows that nestled in the sloping, rambling roofs that were to be stained green like the moss that would grow on them some day. There was to be a piazza across the entire front with rough stone pillars, and a stone paved floor up to which the orchard grass would grow in a gentle terrace. Even now Sam and his helpers were at work starting rose vines of all varieties, to train about the trellises and twine about the pillars. Sam had elected that it should be called Rose Cottage. Who would have ever suspected Sam of having any poetry in his nature? The great stone fireplace with its ancient crane and place to sit inside was to be retained, and built about with more stone, and the partitions between the original sitting room and dining room and hall were to be torn down, to make one splendid living room of which the old fireplace should be the center, with a great window at one side looking toward the sea, and a deep seat with bookcases in the corner. Heavy beams were somehow to be put in the ceiling to support it, and fine wood used in the wainscoting and paneling, with rough soft-toned plaster between and above. The floors were to be smooth, wide boards of hard wood, well fitted. A little gable was to be added on the morning side of the house for a dining room, all windows, with a view of the sea on one side and the river on the other. Upstairs there would be 4 bedrooms and a bathroom, all according to the plan to be white wainscoting halfway up and delicately vined or tinted papers above. Michael took great pleasure in going down to look at the house, and watching the progress that was made with it, as indeed the whole colony did. They called it the boss's cottage, and when they laid off work at night always took a trip to see what had been done during the day, men, women, and children. It was a sort of sacred pilgrimage, wherein they saw their own highest dreams coming true for the man they loved, because he had helped them to a future of possibilities. Not a man of them but wistfully wondered if he would ever get to the place where he could build him a house like that, and resolved secretly to try for it. And always the work went better the next day for the visit to the shrine. But after all, Michael would turn from his house with an empty ache in his heart. What was it for? Not for him. It was not likely he would ever spend happy hours there. He was not like other men. He must take his happiness in making others happy. But one day a new thought came to him, as he watched the laborers working out the plan, and bringing it ever nearer and nearer to the perfect whole. A great desire came to him to have Star see it some day, to know what she would think about it, and if she would like it. The thought occurred to him that perhaps sometime, in the changing of the world, she might chance near that way, and he have opportunity to show her the house that he had built. For her. Not that he would ever tell her that last. She must never know, of course, that she was the only one in all the world he could ever care for. That would seem a great presumption in her eyes. He must keep that to himself. But there would be no harm in showing her the house, and he would make it now as beautiful as if she were to occupy it. He would take his joy in making all things fair, with the hope that she might one day see and approve it. So, as the work drew near its completion, he watched it more and more carefully, matching tints in rooms, and always bringing down some new idea, or finding some particular bit of furniture that would some day fit into a certain niche. In that way he cheated the lonely ache in his heart, and made believe he was happy. And another winter drew its white mantle about its shoulders and prepared to face the blast. It bade fair to be a bitter winter for the poor, for everything was high, and unskilled labor was poorly paid. Sickness and death were abroad, and lurked in the milk supply, the food supply, the unsanitary tenements about the alley, which, because it had not been so bad as some other districts, had been left uncondemned. Yet it was bad enough, and Michael's hands were full to keep his people alive, and try to keep some of them from sinning. For always where there is misery, there is the more sinning. Old Sal sat on her doorstep, shivering, with her tattered shawl about her shoulders, or when it grew too cold, peered from her little muslin-curtained window behind the geranium, to see the dirty white hearse, with its pink-winged angel atop, pass slowly in and out with some little fragment of humanity, and knew that one day her turn would come to leave it all and go. Then she turned back to her little room, which had become the only heaven she knew, and solaced herself with the contents of a black bottle. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 25. During the years of his work in the alley, Michael had become known more and more among workers for the poor, and he found strength in their brotherhood, though he kept mainly to his own little corner, and had little time to go out into other fields. But he had formed some very pleasant, distant friendships among workers, and had met prominent men who were interested in reforms of all sorts. He was hurrying back to his boarding place one evening late in January, with his mind full of the old problem of how to reach the mass of humanity and help them to live in decency, so that they might stand some little chance of being good as well as being alive. At the crossing of another avenue, he met a man whose eloquence as a public speaker was only equaled by his indefatigable tirelessness as a worker among men. "Good evening, Endicott," he said cordially, halting in his rapid walk. "I wonder if you're not the very man I want. Will you do me a favor? I'm in great straits and no time to hunt up anybody." "Anything I can do, Doctor. I am at your service," said Michael. "Good, thank you," said the great man. "Are you free this evening for an hour?" "I can be," said Michael, smiling. The other man's hearty greeting and warm thank you cheered his lonely heart. "Well, then you'll take my place at Madison Square Garden tonight, won't you? I've just had a telegram that my mother is very ill, perhaps dying, and I feel that I must go at once. I'm on my way to the station now. I thought Patton would be at his rooms, perhaps, and he might help me out, but they tell me he's out of town on a lecture tour." "Take your place," said Michael, aghast. "That I'm sure I could never do, Doctor. What were you going to do?" "Why, there's a mass meeting at Madison Square Garden. We're trying to get more playgrounds and roof gardens for poor children, you know. I was to speak about the tenement district, give people a general idea of what the need is, you know. I'm sure you're well acquainted with the subject. They're expecting some big men there who can be big givers if they're touched in the right way. You're very good to help me out. You'll excuse me if I hurry on. It's almost train time. I want to catch the 6 o'clock express west." "But, Doctor," said Michael in dismay, striding along by his side down the street, "I really couldn't do that. I'm not a public speaker, you know. I never addressed a big audience in my life. Isn't there someone else I could get for you?" It was odd that while he was saying it, the vision of the church filled with the fashionable world, waiting for a wedding which did not materialize, came to his thoughts. "Oh, that doesn't make the slightest difference in the world," said the worried man. "You know the subject from A to Z, and I don't know another available soul tonight who does. Just tell them what you know. You needn't talk long. It'll be all right anyway. Just smile your smile, and they'll give all right. Good night, and thank you from my heart. I must take this cab." And he hailed a passing cab, and sprang inside, calling out above the city's din, "8 o'clock the meeting is. Don't worry, you'll come out all right. It'll be good practice for your business." Michael stood still in the middle of the crowded pavement, and looked after the departing cab in dismay. If ever in all his life had he come to a spot where he felt so utterly inadequate to fill a situation. Frantically he tried, as he started down the street again, to think of someone else to ask. There seemed to be no one at all who was used to speaking that knew the subject. The few who knew were either out of town or at a great distance. He did not know how to reach them in time. Besides, there was something about Michael that just would not let him shirk a situation, no matter how trying it was to him. It was one of the first principles he had been taught with football, and before he reached his boarding place, his chin was up and his lips firmly set. Anyone who knew him well would have felt sure Michael was going into a scrimmage and expected the fighting to be hard. It was Will French who dug it out of him after dinner, and laughed and slapped him gleefully on the shoulder. Will was engaged to Hester now, and he was outrageously happy. "Good work, old fellow. You've got your chance. Now give it to him. I don't know anybody can do it better. I'd like to bring a millionaire or two to hear you. You've been there, now tell him. Don't frown like that, old fellow. I tell you, you've got the chance of your life. Why don't you tell him about the tenement in the alley?" Michael's face cleared. "I hadn't thought of it, Will. Do you think I could? It isn't exactly on the subject. I understood him I was to speak of the tenement in relation to the playground." "The very thing," said Will. "Didn't he tell you to say what you knew? Well, give it to him straight, and you'll see those rich old fellows open their eyes. Some of them own some of those old rickety shacks, and probably don't know what they own. Tell him. Perhaps the old man who owns our tenement will be there. Who knows?" "By the way," said Michael, his face all alight, "did I tell you that Milbourne told me the other day that they think they're on track of the real owner of our tenement? The agent let out something the last time they talked with him, and they think they may discover who he is, though he's hidden himself well behind agents for years. If we can find out who he is, we may be able to help him understand what great need there is for him to make a few changes." "Yes, a few changes," sneered Will. "Tear down the whole rotten death trap and build a new one with light and air and a chance for human beings to live. Give it to him, old man. He may be there tonight." "I believe I will," said Michael, thoughtfully, the look of winning beginning to dawn on his speaking face. And he went up to his room and locked his door. When he came out again, Will, who was waiting to accompany him to the meeting, saw in his eyes the look of the dreamer, the man who sees into the future and prophesies. He knew that Michael would not fail in his speech that night. He gave a knowing look to Hester as she came out to go with him, and Hester understood. They walked behind him quietly for the most part, or speaking in low tones. They felt the pride and the anxiety of the moment as much as if they had been going to make the speech themselves. The angel in the man had dominated them also. Now it happened that Star had come down with her father for a week's shopping the last time he ran up to his sister's, and on this particular evening she had claimed her father's society. "Can't you stay at home, Daddy dear?" she asked wistfully. "I don't want to go to Aunt Frances's quiet little evening one bit. I told her you needed me tonight, as we've only a day or two more left before I go back." Aunt Frances was Star's mother's sister, and as the servants of the two families agreed mutually, just like her, only more so. Star had never been quite happy in her company. "Come with me for a little while, daughter. I'm sorry I can't stay at home all the evening, but I rather promised I'd drop into a charitable meeting at Madison Square for a few minutes this evening. They're counting on my name, I believe. We won't need to stay long, and if you're with me it will be easier to get away." "Agreed," said Star eagerly, and got herself ready in a twinkling. And so it came about that as the roll of martial music poured forth from the fine instruments secured for the occasion, and the leaders and speakers of the evening, together with the presidents of this society and that army or settlement or organization for the belief and benefit of the poor, filed on to the great platform, that Star and her father occupied prominent seats in the vast audience, and joined in the enthusiasm that spread like a wave before the great American flag that burst out in brilliant electric lights of red and white and blue, a signal that the hour and the moment was come. Michael came in with the others, as calmly as though he had spent his life preparing for the public platform. There was fire in his eyes, the fire of passion for the people of the slums who were his kin. He looked over the audience with a throb of joy to think he had so mighty an opportunity. His pulses were not stirred, because he had no consciousness of self in this whole performance. His subject was to live before the people. He himself was nothing at all. He had no fear but he could tell them, if that was all they wanted. Burning sentences, hot with the blood of souls, had been pouring through his mind ever since he had decided to talk of his people. He was only in a hurry to begin, lest they would not give him time to tell all he knew. All he knew. Could it ever be told? It was endless as eternity. With a strange stirring of her heart, Star recognized him. She felt the color stealing into her face. She thought her father must notice it, and cast a furtive glance at him, but he was deep in conversation about some banking business. So she sat and watched Michael during the opening exercises, and wondered how he came to be there, and what was his office in this thing. Did lawyers get paid for doing something to help along charitable institutions? She supposed so. He was probably given a seat on the platform for his pains. Yet she could not help thinking how fine he looked, sitting there in the center, the place of honor, it would seem. How came he there? He was taller than all the others, whether sitting or standing, and his fine form and bearing made him exceedingly noticeable. Star could hear women about her whispering to their escorts, "Who is he?" And her heart gave strange little throbs to think that she knew. It seemed odd to her that she should be taken back by the sight of him, now, through all the years, to that morning in Florida, when she had kissed him in the chapel. Somehow there seemed something sweet and tender in the memory, and she dwelt upon it, while she watched him looking calmly over the audience, rising and moving to let another pass him, bowing and smiling to a noted judge who leaned over to grasp his hand. Did young lawyers like that get to know noted judges? And wherever did he get his grace? There was rhythm and beauty in his every motion. Star had never had such a splendid opportunity to look at him before, for in all that sea of faces she knew hers would be lost to him, and she might watch him at her will. "Daddy, did you know that Michael was up there?" she asked after a while, when her father's friend went back to his seat. "Michael? No, where? On the platform? I wonder what in the world he is doing there. He must be mixed up in this thing somehow. I understand he's stuck at his mission work. I tried to stop him several years ago. Told him it would ruin his prospects, but he was too stubborn to give up. So he's here." And Mr. Endicott searched out Michael and studied the beautiful face keenly, looking in vain for any marks of degradation or fast living. The head was lifted with its conquering look. The eyes shone forth like jewels. Michael was a man, a son, to be proud of, he told himself, and breathed a heavy sigh. That was one time when his stubbornness had not conquered, and he found himself glad, in spite of himself, that it had not. The opening exercises were mere preliminary speeches and resolutions, mixed with music, and interspersed by the introduction of the mayor of the city, and one or two other notables who said a few apathetic words of commendation for the work in hand, and retired on their laurels. "I understand this Dr. Glidden, who is to speak, is quite an eloquent fellow," said Star's father, as the president got up to introduce the speaker of the evening, whom all had come to hear. "The man who was just talking with me says he is really worth hearing. If he grows tiresome, we will slip out. I wonder which one he is. He must be that man with the iron-gray hair over there." "Oh, I don't want to go out," said Star. "I like it. I never was in a great meeting like this. I like to hear them cheer." Her cheeks were rosy, for in her heart she was finding out that she had a great longing to stay there and watch Michael a little longer. "I'm sorry to have to tell you that our friend and advertised speaker for the evening was called away by the sudden and serious illness of his mother, and left for the West on the 6 o'clock express," said the chairman in his inadequate little voice that seemed always straining beyond its height, and never accomplishing anything in the way of being heard. A sigh of disappointment swept over the part of the audience near enough to the platform to hear, and some men reached for their hats. "Well, now that's a pity," whispered Endicott. "I guess we better go before they slip in any dry old substitutes. I've been seen here, that's enough." But Star laid a detaining hand on her father's arm. "Wait a little, Daddy," she said softly. "But he has sent a substitute," went on the chairman. "A man whom he says is 100% better able to talk on the subject than himself. He spoke to me from the station phone just before he left, and told me that he felt that you would all agree he had done well to go when you had heard the man whom he has sent in his place. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Michael Endicott, who will speak to you this evening on the needs of the tenement dwellers. Mr. Endicott." Amid the silence that ensued after the feebly polite applause, Michael rose. For just an instant he stood, looking over the audience, and a strange, subtle thrill ran over the vast assemblage. Then Michael, insensibly measuring the spacious hall, flung his clear, beautiful voice out into it, and reached the uttermost bounds of the room. "Did you know that there are in this city now 71,877 totally dark rooms? Some of them connected with an air shaft 28 inches wide and 70 feet deep. Many of them absolutely without access to even a dark shaft. And that these rooms are the only place in the whole wide, beautiful world for thousands of little children, unless they stay in the street?" The sentence shot through the audience like a great deliberate bolt of lightning that crashed through the hearts of the hearers, and tore away every vestige of their complacency. The people sat up and took notice. Star thrilled and trembled, she knew not why. "There is a tenement with rooms like this, a dumbbell tenement it is called, in the alley, where, for aught I know, I was born." "Oh!" The sound swept over the listeners in a great wave, like a sob of protest. Men and women raised their opera glasses and looked at the speaker again. They asked one another, "Who is he?" and settled quiet to hear what more he had to say. Then Michael went on to tell of 3 dark little rooms in his tenement, where a family of 8, accustomed to better things, had been forced by circumstances to make their home, and where in the dark the germs of tuberculosis had been silently growing, until the whole family were infected. He spoke of a little 10-year-old girl, living in one of these little dark rooms, pushed down on the street by a playmate, an accident that would have been thought nothing of in a healthy child, but in this little one it produced tubercular meningitis, and after 2 days of agony the child died. He told of a delicate girl, who with her brother were the sole wage earners of the family, working all day, and sewing far into the night, to make clothes for the little brothers and sisters who had fallen prey to the white plague. He told instance after instance of sickness and death, all resulting from the terrible conditions in this one tenement, until a delicate, refined-looking woman down in the audience, who had dropped in with her husband for a few minutes on the way to some other gathering, drew her soft mantle about her shoulders with a shiver, and whispered, "Really, Charles, it can't be healthy to have such a terrible state of things in the city where we live. I should think germs would get out and float around to us. Something ought to be done to clean such low creatures out of a decent community. Do let's go now. I don't feel as if I could listen to another word. I shan't be able to enjoy the reception." But the husband sat frowning and listening to the end of the speech, vouchsafing to her whisper only the single growl, "Don't be a fool, Selina." On and on Michael went, literally taking his audience with him, through room after room of his tenement, showing them horrors they had never dreamed, giving them now and again a glimmer of light when he told of a curtained window with 15 minutes of sun every morning, where a little cripple sat to watch for her sunbeam, and push her pot of geraniums along the sill that it might have the entire benefit of its brief shining. He put the audience into peals of laughter over the wit of some poor creatures in certain trying situations, showing that a sense of humor is not lacking in the other half, and then set them weeping over a little baby's funeral. He told them forcibly how hard the workers were trying to clean out and improve this terrible state of things, how cruelly slow the owner of this particular tenement was even to cut windows into dark air shafts, how so far it had been impossible to discover the name of the true owner of the building, because he had for years successfully hidden behind agents who held the building in trust. The speech closed in a mighty appeal to the people of New York to rise up in a mass and wipe out this curse of the tenements, and build in their places light, airy, clean, wholesome dwellings, where people might live and work and learn the lessons of life aright, and where sin could find no dark hole in which to hatch her loathsome offspring. As Michael sat down amid a burst of applause, such as is given to few speakers, another man stepped to the front of the platform, and the cheers of commendation were hushed somewhat, only to swell and break forth again. For this man was one of the city's great minds, and always welcome on any platform. He had been asked to make the final appeal for funds for the playgrounds. It had been considered a great stroke of luck on the part of the committee to secure him. "My friends," said he, when the hush came at last and he could be heard, "I appreciate your feelings. I would like to spend the remainder of the night in applauding the man who has just finished speaking." The clamor showed signs of breaking forth again. "This man has spoken well because he has spoken from his heart, and he has told us that he knows whereof he speaks, for he has lived in those tenement rooms himself, one of the little children like those for whom he pleads. I am told that he has given almost every evening for 4 years out of a busy life which is just opening into great promise, to help these people of his. I am reminded as I have been listening to him of Lanier's wonderful poem, The Marshes of Glynn. Do you recall it? Ye spread and span like the Catholic man, who hath mightily won God out of knowledge, and good out of infinite pain, and sight out of blindness, and purity out of a stain. Let us get to work at once and do our duty. I see you do not need urging. My friends, if such a man as this, a prince among men, can come out of the slums, then the slums are surely worth redeeming." The audience thundered and clamored and thundered again. Women sobbed openly, while the ushers hurried about collecting the eager offerings of the people. For Michael had won the day, and everybody was ready to give. It sort of helped to get the burden of such a state of things off their consciences. Star had sat through the whole speech with glowing cheeks and lashes wet. Her heart throbbed with wonder and a kind of personal pride in Michael. Somehow all the years that had passed between seemed to have dropped away, and she saw before her the boy who had told her of the Florida sunset, and filled her with childish admiration over his beautiful thoughts. His story appealed to her. The lives of the little ones about whom he had been telling were like his poor neglected existence before her father took him up. The little lonely life that had been freely offered to save her own. She forgot now all that had passed between, her anger at his not coming to ride, and after her return from abroad, not coming to call, nor accepting her invitations, her rage at his interference in her affairs. Her persistence in her own folly seemed now unspeakable. She was ashamed of herself. The tears were streaming down her cheeks, but of this she was quite unaware. When the speeches were over, and the uproar of applause had somewhat subsided, Star turned to her father, her face aglow, her lashes still dewy with tears. Her father had been silent and absorbed. His face was inscrutable now. He had a way of masking his emotions, even to those who knew him best. "Daddy dear," whispered Star, "couldn't we buy that tenement and build it over? I should so love to give those little children happy homes." Endicott turned and looked at his treasured child, her lovely face all eagerness now. She had infinite faith in her father's ability to purchase anything she wanted. The father himself had been deeply stirred. He looked at her searchingly at first, then yearningly, tenderly, but his voice was almost gruff as he said, I'll see about it." "Couldn't you let Michael know now, Daddy? I think it would be such a help to him to know that his speech has done some good." The voice was very sweet and appealing. "Couldn't you send him word by one of the ushers?" I suppose I could." Endicott took out his fountain pen and a business card and began to write. "You don't suppose, Daddy, that the owner will object to selling? There won't be any trouble about it that way, will there?" "No, I don't think there'll be any trouble." Endicott slipped the card into an envelope he found in his pocket, and calling an usher, asked him to take it to the platform to Michael. What he had written was this: "I suppose you've been talking about my property. Pull the tenement down if you like, and build a model one. I'll foot the bills. D.E." When Michael, surprised at receiving a communication on the platform, tore the envelope open and read, his face fairly blazed with glory. Star was watching him, and her heart gave a queer little throb of pleasure at the light in his eyes. The next instant he was on his feet, and with a whispered word to the chairman, came to the front of the platform. His raised hand brought instant silence. "I have good news. May I share it with you? The owner of that tenement is in this house, and has sent me word that he will tear it down and build a model one in its place." The ring in Michael's voice and the light on his face was equivalent to a dozen votes of thanks. The audience rose to its feet and cheered. "Daddy, oh Daddy, are you the owner?" There was astonishment, reproof, excuse, and forgiveness all mingled in Star's voice. "Come, Star," said her father abruptly, "we better go home. This is a hot, noisy place, and I'm tired." "Daddy dear, of course you didn't know how things were," said Star sweetly. "You didn't, did you, Daddy?" "No, I didn't know," said Endicott evasively, "that Michael has a great gift of gab. Would you like to stop and have an ice somewhere, daughter?" "No, Daddy, I'd rather go home and plan how to make over that tenement. I don't believe I'd enjoy an ice after what I've heard tonight. Why is it some people have so much more than others to start with?" Deep question, child. Better not trouble your brains with it." And Star saw that her father, though deeply moved, did not wish to discuss the matter. The next day Michael called at Endicott's office, but did not find him in, and wrote a letter out of the overwhelming joy of his heart, asking permission to call and thank his benefactor and talk over plans. The following day he received the curt reply: "Son, make your plans to suit yourself. Don't spare expense within reason. No thanks needed. I did it for Star. You made a good speech." Michael choked down his disappointment over this rebuff, and tried to take all the joy of it. He was not forgiven yet. He might not enter the sacred precincts of intercourse again, but he was beloved. He could not help feeling that because of that "son" with which the communication began. And the grudging praise his speech received was more to Michael than all the adulation that people had been showering upon him since the night of the mass meeting. But Star knew about it. He did it for Star. She had wanted it. She had perhaps been there. She must have been there, or how else would she have known? The thought thrilled him, and thrilled him anew. Oh, if he might have seen her before him! But then perhaps he would not have been able to tell his story, and so it was just as well. But Star was interested in his work, his plans. What a wonderful thing to have her work with him, even in this indirect way. Oh, if someday. If. But right here Michael shut down his thoughts and went to work. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Lowell Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 26. Late in January, Michael was taking his nightly walk homeward by way of the Endicott home. He was convinced that Star was still away from home, for he had seen no lights now for several weeks in the room that he knew was her own. But there was always the chance that she might have returned. He was nearing the house when he saw from the opposite direction a man turn the corner, and with halting gait come slowly toward the house and pause before the steps uncertainly. Something familiar in the man's attitude caused Michael to hasten his steps, and coming closer he found that it was Mr. Endicott himself, and that he stood looking up the steps of his home as though they had been a difficult hill which he must climb. Michael stopped beside him, saying good evening, the thrill of his voice conveying his own joy in the meeting in addition to a common greeting. "Is that you, son?" asked the older man, swaying slightly toward him. "I'm glad you came. I feel strangely dizzy. I wish you'd help me in." Michael's arm was about the other's shoulders at once, and his ready strength almost lifted his benefactor up the steps. His steady hand with the key made short work of the night latch, and without waiting to call a servant, he helped Mr. Endicott up to his room and to his bed. The man sank back wearily with a sigh and closed his eyes, then suddenly roused himself. "Thank you, son. And will you send a message to Star that I am not able to come on tonight as I promised? Tell her I'll likely be all right tomorrow, and we'll try to come then. You'll find the address at the head of the telephone list in the hall there. I guess you'll have to phone for the doctor. I don't seem to feel like myself. There must be something the matter. I think I've taken a heavy cold." Michael hurried to the phone and called up the physician, begging him to come at once, for he could see that Mr. Endicott was very ill. His voice trembled as he gave the message to the Western Union over the phone. It seemed almost like talking to Star, though he sent the telegram in her father's name. The message sent, he hurried back to the sick man, who seemed to have fallen in a sort of stupor. His face was flushed and hot. The veins in his temples and neck were throbbing rapidly. In all his healthy life, Michael had seen little of illness, but he recognized it now and knew it must be a violent attack. If only he knew something to do until the doctor should arrive. Hot water used to be the universal remedy for all diseases at college. The matron always had someone bring hot water when anyone was ill. Michael went downstairs to find a servant, but they must all be asleep, for he had been unusually late in leaving the alley that night. However, he found that the bathroom would supply plenty of hot water, so he set to work to undress his patient, wrap him in a blanket, and soak his feet in hot water. But the patient showed signs of faintness, and was unable to sit up. A foot bath under such conditions was difficult to administer. The unaccustomed nurse got his patient into bed again with arduous labor, and was just wondering what to do next when the doctor arrived. Michael watched the grave face of the old doctor as he examined the sick man, and knew that his intuitions had been right. Mr. Endicott was very seriously ill. The doctor examined his patient with deliberation, his face growing more and more serious. At last he stepped out of the room and motioned Michael to follow him. "Are you a relative, young man?" he asked, looking at Michael keenly. "No, only one who is very much indebted to him." "Well, it's lucky for him if you feel that indebtedness now. Do you know what is the matter with him?" "No," said Michael. "He looks pretty sick to me. What is it?" "Smallpox," said the doctor laconically, "and a tough case at that." Then he looked keenly at the fine specimen of manhood before him, noting with alert eye that there had been no blanching of panic in the beautiful face, no slightest movement as if to get out of the room. The young man was not a coward, anyway. "How long have you been with him?" he asked abruptly. "Since I telephoned you," said Michael. I happened to be passing the house and saw him trying to get up the steps alone. He was dizzy, he said, and seemed glad to have me come to his help. Have you ever been vaccinated? No, said Michael indifferently. The wisest thing for you to do would be to get out of the room at once and let me vaccinate you. I'll try to send a nurse to look after him as soon as possible. Where are the family? Not at home? And the servants will probably scatter as soon as they learn what's the matter. A pity he hadn't been taken to the hospital, but it's hardly safe to move him now. The fact is, he is a very sick man, and there's only one chance in 100 of saving him. You've run some big risks, taking care of him this way. Any bigger than you were running, Doctor? Michael smiled gravely. Well, it's my business, and I don't suppose it is yours. There are people who are paid for those things. Come, get out of this room, or I won't answer for the consequences. The consequences will have to answer for themselves, Doctor. I'm going to stay here till somebody better comes to nurse him. Michael's eyes did not flinch as he said this. Suppose you take the disease. Michael smiled, one of his brilliant smiles that you could almost hear, it was so bright. Why, then I will, said Michael, but I'll stay well long enough to take care of him until the nurse comes anyway. You might die. Of course, in a tone with not a ruffle in the calm purpose. Well, it's my duty to tell you that you'd probably be throwing your life away, for there's only a chance that he won't die. Not throwing it away if I made him suffer a little less. And you said there was a chance. If I didn't stay, he might miss that chance, mightn't he? Probably. Can I do anything to help or ease him? Yes. Then I stay. I should stay anyway until someone came. I couldn't leave him so. Very well then. I'm proud to know a man like you. There's plenty to be done. Let's get to work. The hour that followed was filled with instructions and labor. Michael had no time to think what would become of his work or anything. He only knew that this was the present duty, and he went forward in it step by step. Before the doctor left, he vaccinated Michael, and gave him careful directions how to take all necessary precautions for his own safety. But he knew from the lofty look in the young man's face that these were mere secondary considerations with him. If the need came for the sake of the patient, all precautions would be flung aside as not mattering one whit. The doctor roused the servants and told them what had happened, and tried to persuade them to stay quietly in their places, and he would see that they ran no risks if they obeyed his directions. But to a man and a woman they were panic-stricken, gathering their effects. They, like the Arabs of old, folded their tents and silently stole away in the night. Before morning dawned, Michael and his patient were in sole possession of the house. Early in the morning there came a call from the doctor. He had not been able to secure the nurse he hoped to get. Could Michael hold the fort a few hours longer? He would relieve him sooner if possible, but experienced nurses for contagious cases were hard to get just now. There was a great deal of sickness. He might be able to get one this morning, but it was doubtful. He had telephoned everywhere. Of course, Michael would hold the fort. The doctor gave explicit directions, asked a number of questions, and promised to call as soon as possible. Michael, alone in the great silence that the occasional babble of a delirious person emphasizes in an otherwise empty house, began to think of things that must be done. Fortunately, there was a telephone in the room. He would not have to leave his patient alone. He called up Will French and told him in a few words what had happened. Laughed pleasantly at Will's fears for him. Asked him to look after the alley work and to attend to one or two little matters connected with his office work which could not be put off. Then he called up Sam at the farm, for Michael had long ago found it necessary to have a telephone put in at Old Orchard. The sound of Sam's voice cheered his heart when, after Michael's brief simple explanation of his present position as trained nurse for the head of the house of Endicott, who lay sick of smallpox, Sam responded with a dismayed, "For de lub o' Mike." When Michael had finished all his directions to Sam, and received his partner's promise to do everything just as Michael would have done it, Sam broke out with, Say, does that Ike know what he's taken off on you?"
"Who, Mr. Endicott?" "No, Sam, he doesn't know anything. He's delirious."
Grunted Sam, deeply troubled. "Well, you better find out when he gets hisself again, or there'll be something coming to him."
"He's done a great deal for me, Sam."
Well, you're getting it back on him, sure thing now, all right. Say, you take care of yourself, Mickey. We all can't do nothing without you. You let me know every day how you be."
"Sure, Sam," responded Michael, deeply touched by the choking sound of Sam's voice. "Don't you worry. I'm sound as a nut. Nothing'll happen to me. The doctor vaccinated me, and I'll not catch it. You look after things for me, and I'll be on deck again some day, all the better for the rest." Michael sat back in the chair after hanging up the receiver, his eyes glistening with moisture. To think the day had come when Sam should care like that. It was a miracle. Michael went back again to the bed to look after his patient, and after he had done everything that the doctor had said, he decided to reconnoiter for some breakfast. There must be something in the house to eat, even if the servants had all departed, and he ought to eat so that his strength should be equal to his task. It was late in the morning, nearly 10:30. The young man hurried downstairs and began to ransack the pantry. He did not want to be long away from the upper room. Once, as he was stooping to search the refrigerator for butter and milk, he paused in his work and thought he heard a sound at the front door. But then all seemed still, and he hurriedly put a few things on a tray and carried them upstairs. He might not be able to come down again for several hours. But when he reached the top of the stairs, he heard a voice, not his patient's, but a woman's voice, sweet and clear and troubled. "Daddy, oh, Daddy dear, why don't you speak to your little girl? What is the matter? Can you understand me? Your face and your poor hands are so hot they burn me. Daddy, Daddy dear."
It was Star's voice, and Michael's heart stood still with the thrill of it, and the instant horror of it. Star was there in the room of death with her father. She was exposed to the terrible contagion. She, the beautiful, frail treasure of his heart. He set the tray down quickly on the hall table and went swiftly to the door. She sat on the side of the bed, her arms about her father's unconscious form, and her head buried in his neck, sobbing. For an instant Michael was frozen to the spot with horror at her dangerous situation. If she had wanted to take the disease, she could not have found a more sure way of exposing herself. The next instant, Michael's senses came back, and without stopping to think, he sprang forward and caught her up in his arms, bearing her from the room and setting her down at the bathroom door. "Oh, Star, what have you done?" he said, a catch in his voice like a sob, for he did not know what he was saying. Star, frightened, struggling, sobbing, turned and looked at him.
"Michael, how did you come to be here? Oh, what is the matter with my father?" "Go wash your hands and face quickly with this antiseptic soap," he commanded, all on the alert now, and dealing out the things the doctor had given him for his own safety. "And here, rinse your mouth with this quickly, and gargle your throat. Then go and change your things as quick as you can. Your father has the smallpox, and you have been in there close to him." "The smallpox?" "Hurry," commanded Michael, handing her the soap and turning on the hot water. Star obeyed him, because when Michael spoke in that tone, people always did obey. But her frightened eyes kept seeking his face for some reassurance. "The smallpox! Oh, Michael, how dreadful! But how do you know? Has the doctor been here? And how did you happen to be here?" "I was passing last night, when your father came home, and he asked me to help him in. Yes, the doctor was here, and will soon come again and bring a nurse. Now hurry. You must get away from the vicinity of this room." "But I'm not going away," said Star, stubbornly. "I'm going to stay by my father. He'll want me." "Your father would be distressed beyond measure if he knew that you were exposed to such terrible danger. I know that he would far rather have you go away at once. Besides, he is delirious, and your presence cannot do him any good now. You must take care of yourself, so that when he gets well, you will be well too, and able to help him get back into health again." "But you are staying." "It does not matter about me," said Michael. "There is no one to care. Besides, I am a man, and perfectly strong. I do not think I will take the disease. Now please take off those things you wore in there, and get something clean that has not been in the room, and go away from here as quickly as you can." Michael had barely persuaded her to take precautions when the doctor arrived with a nurse, and the promise of another before night. He scolded Star thoroughly for her foolhardiness in going into her father's room. He had been the family physician ever since she was born, knew her well, and took the privilege of scolding when he liked. Star meekly succumbed. There was just one thing she would not do, and that was to go away out of the house while her father remained in so critical a condition. The doctor frowned and scolded, but finally agreed to let her stay. And indeed it seemed as if perhaps it was the only thing that could be done, for she had undoubtedly been exposed to the disease, and was subject to quarantine. There seemed to be no place to which she could safely go, where she could be comfortable, and the house was amply large enough for 2 or 3 parties to remain in quarantine in several detachments. There was another question to be considered. The nurses would have their hands full with their patient. Someone must stay in the house and look after things, see that they needed nothing, and get some kind of meals. Star, of course, knew absolutely nothing about cooking, and Michael's experience was limited to roasting sweet potatoes around a bonfire at college, and cooking eggs and coffee at the fireplace on the farm. But a good cook to stay in a plague-stricken dwelling would be a thing of time, if procurable at all. So the doctor decided to accept the willing services of these 2. Star was established in her own room upstairs, which could be shut away from the front part of the house by a short passageway and 2 doors, with access to the lower floor by means of the back stairs. And Michael made a bed of the soft couch in the tiny reception room, where he had twice passed through trying experiences. Great curtains, kept constantly wet with antiseptics, shut away the sick room and adjoining apartments from the rest of the house. It was arranged that Michael should place such supplies as were needed at the head of the stairs, just outside the guarding curtains, and the nurses should pass all dishes through an antiseptic bath before sending them downstairs again. The electric bells and telephones with which the house was well supplied made it possible for them to communicate with one another, without danger of infection. Star was at once vaccinated, and the 2 young people received many precautions and injunctions, with medicine and a strict regime. And even then the old doctor shook his head dubiously. If those 2 beautiful faces should have to pass through the ordeal of that dread disease, his old heart would be quite broken. All that skill and science could do to prevent it should be done. So the house settled down to the quiet of a daily routine, the busy city humming and thundering outside, but no more a part of them than if they had been living in a tomb. The card of warning on the door sent all the neighbors in the block scurrying off in a panic to Palm Beach or Europe, and even the strangers passed by on the other side. The grocery boy and the milkman left their orders hurriedly on the front steps, and Michael and Star might almost have used the street for an exercise ground if they had chosen, so deserted had it become. But there was no need for them to go farther than the door in front, for there was a lovely side and back yard, screened from the street by a high wall, where they might walk at will when they were not too busy with their work, which for their unskilled hands was hard and laborious. Nevertheless, their orders were strict, and every day they were out for a couple of hours at least. To keep from getting chilled, Michael invented all sorts of games when they grew tired of just walking. And twice after a new fall of snow, they went out and had a game of snowballing, coming in with glowing faces and shining eyes, to change wet garments and hurry back to their kitchen work. But this was after the first few serious days were past, and the doctor had given them hope that if all went well, there was a good chance of the patient pulling through. They settled into their new life like 2 children who had known each other a long time. All the years between were as if they had not been. They made their blunders, were merry over their work,
and grew into each other's companionship charmingly. Their ideas of cooking were most primitive, and had it not been possible to order things sent in from caterers, they and the nurses might have been in danger of starving to death. But as it was, what with telephoning to the nurses for directions, and what with studying the recipes on the outside of boxes of cornstarch and farina and oatmeal and the like that they found in the pantry, they were learning day by day to do a little more. And then one blessed day, the dear Nurse Morton walked in and took off her things and stayed. Morton had been on a long-delayed visit to her old father in Scotland that winter. But when she saw in the papers the notice of the calamity that had befallen the house of her old employer, she packed her trunk and took the first steamer back to America. Her baby and her baby's father needed her, and nothing could keep Morton away after that. Her coming relieved the situation very materially, for though she had never been a fancy cook, she knew all about good old-fashioned Scotch dishes, and from the first hour took up her station in the kitchen. Immediately comfort and orderliness began to reign, and Star and Michael had time on their hands that was not spent in either eating, sleeping, working, or exercise. It was then that they began to read together, for the library was filled with all the treasures of literature, to many of which Michael had never had access save through the public libraries, which of course was not as satisfactory as having books at hand, when one had a bit of leisure in a busy life. Star had been reading more than ever before this winter while with her aunt, and entered into the pleasant companionship of a book together with zest. Then there were hours when Star played softly and sang, for the piano was far from the sick room and could not be heard upstairs. Indeed, if it had not been for the anxious struggle going on upstairs, these two would have been having a beautiful time. For all unknowing to themselves, they were growing daily into a dear delight in the mere presence of one another. Even Michael, who had long ago laid down the lines between which he must walk through life, and never expected to be more to Star than a friend and protector, did not realize whither this intimate companionship was tending. When he thought of it at all, he thought that it was a precious solace for his years of loneliness, a time that must be enjoyed to the full, and treasured in memory for the days of barrenness that must surely follow. Upstairs the fight went on day after day, until at last one morning the doctor told them that it had been won, that the patient, though very much enfeebled, would live and slowly get back his strength. That was a happy morning. The two caught each other's hands and whirled joyously round the dining room when they heard it. And Morton came in with her sleeves rolled up, and her eyes like two blue lakes all blurred with raindrops in the sunlight. Her face seemed like a rainbow. The next morning the doctor looked the two over before he went upstairs and set a limit to their quarantine. If they kept on doing well, they would be reasonably safe from taking the disease. It would be a miracle, almost, if neither of them took it, but it began to look as if they were going to be all right. Now these two had been so absorbed in one another that they had thought very little about the danger of their taking the disease themselves. If either had been alone in the house with nothing to do but brood, it would have probably been the sole topic of thought. But their healthy, busy hours had helped the good work on, and so they were coming safely out from under the danger. It was one bright morning when they were waiting for the doctor to come that Michael was glancing over the morning paper, and Star trying a new song she had sent for that had just come in the mail the evening before. She wanted to be able to play it for Michael to sing. Suddenly Michael gave a little exclamation of dismay, and Star, turning on the piano stool, saw that his face was white, and he was staring out of the window with a drawn, sad look about his mouth and eyes. "What is it?" she asked, in quick, eager tones of sympathy. And Michael, turning to look at her vivid beauty, his heart thrilling with the sound of her voice, suddenly felt the wide gulf that had always been between them, for what he had read in the paper had shaken him from his happy dream, and brought him back to a sudden realization of what he was. The item in the paper that had brought about this rude awakening was an account of how Buck had broken jail and escaped. Michael's great heart was filled with trouble about Buck, and instantly he remembered that he belonged to the same class with Buck, and not at all in the charmed circle where Star moved. He looked at the girl with grave, tender eyes, that yet seemed to be less intimate than they had been all these weeks. Her sensitive nature felt the difference at once. He let her read the little item. Star's face softened with ready sympathy, and a mingling of indignation. "He was one of those people in your tenements you've been trying to help?" she questioned, trying to understand his look. "He ought to have been ashamed to get into jail after you had been helping him. Wasn't he a sort of a worthless fellow?" "No," said Michael in quick defense. "He never had a chance. And he was not just one of those people. He was the one. He was the boy who took care of me when I was a little fellow, and who shared everything he had, hard crust or warm cellar door, with me. I think he loved me." There was something in Michael's face and voice that warned Star these were sacred precincts, where she must tread lightly if she did not wish to desecrate. "Tell me about him," she breathed softly. So Michael, his eyes tender, his voice gentle, because she had cared to know, told her eloquently of Buck, till when he had finished, her eyes were wet with tears, and she looked so sweet that he had to turn his own eyes away to keep from taking the lovely vision into his arms and kissing her. It was a strange, wild impulse he had to do this, and it frightened him. Suppose some day he should forget himself, and let her see how he had dared to love her. That must never be. He must put a watch upon himself. This sweet friendship she had vouchsafed him must never be broken by word, look, or action of his. And from that morning there came upon his manner a change, subtle, intangible, but a change. They read and talked together, and Michael opened his heart to her as he had not yet done, about his work in the alley, his farm colony, and his hopes for his people. Star listened and entered eagerly into his plans, yet felt the change that had come upon him, and her troubled spirit knew not what it was. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 27. All this while, Michael had been in daily communication with Sam, as well as with Will French, who, with Hester's help, had kept the rooms in the alley going, though they reported that the head had been sorely missed. Sam had reported daily progress with the house, and about 2 weeks before Michael's release from quarantine, announced that everything was done, even to the papering of the walls and the oiling of the floors. A fire had been burning in the furnace and fireplaces for several weeks, so the plaster was thoroughly dry, and it was Michael's plan that Star and her father were to go straight down to the farm as soon as they were free to leave the house. To this end, Hester and Will had been given daily commissions to purchase this and that needful article of furniture, until now at last Michael felt that the house would be habitable for Star and her precious invalid. During the entire winter, Michael had pleased himself in purchasing rugs here and there, and charming, fitting furniture for the house he was building. A great many things, the important things, had already been selected, and Michael knew he could trust Hester's taste for the rest. For some reason he had never said much to Star about either Hester or Will, perhaps because they had always seemed to him to belong to one another, and thus were somewhat set apart from his own life. But one morning, Star, coming into the library where Michael was telephoning Hester about some last purchases she was making, overheard these words. "All right, Hester, you'll know best, of course, but I think you better make it a dozen instead of a half. It's better to have too many than too few, and we might have company, you know." Now, of course, Star couldn't possibly be supposed to know that it was a question of dishes that was being discussed so intimately. In fact, she did not stop to think what they were talking about. She only knew that he had called this other girl Hester, and she suddenly became aware that during all these weeks of pleasant intercourse, although she had addressed him as Michael, he had carefully avoided using any name at all for her, except on one or two occasions, substituting pronouns wherever possible. She had not noticed this before, but when she heard that Hester in his pleasant tones, her heart brought the fact before her at once for invoice. Who was this girl Hester? And why was she Hestered so carelessly, as though he had a right? Could it be possible that Michael was engaged to her? Why had she never thought of it before? Of course it would be perfectly natural. This other girl had been down in his dear alley, working shoulder to shoulder with him all these years, and it was a matter of course that he must love her. Star's bright morning, that but a moment before had been filled with so much sunshine, seemed suddenly to cloud over with a blackness that blotted out all the joy. And though she strove to hide it even from herself, her spirit was heavy with something she did not understand. That evening Michael came into the library unexpectedly. He had been out in the kitchen helping Morton to open a box that was refractory. He found the room entirely dark, and thought he heard a soft sound like sobbing in one corner of the room. "Star," he said. "Star, is that you?" Nor knew that he had called her by her name, though she knew it very well indeed. She kept quite still for an instant, and then she rose from the little crumpled heap in the corner of the leather couch, where she had dropped for a minute in the dark, to cry out the strange ache of her heart, when she thought Michael was safely in the kitchen for a while. "Why, yes, Michael," she said, and her voice sounded choky, though she was struggling to make it natural. Michael stepped to the doorway and turned on the hall lights so that he could dimly see her little figure standing in the shadow. Then he came over toward her, his whole heart yearning over her, but a mighty control set upon himself. "What is the matter, dear?" He breathed the last word almost under his breath. He actually did not realize that he had spoken it aloud. It seemed to envelop her with a deep tenderness. It broke her partial self-control entirely, and she sobbed again for a minute before she could speak. Oh, if he but dared to take that dear form into his arms and comfort her! If he but dared! But he had no right. Michael stood still and struggled with his heart, standing quite near her, yet not touching her. "Oh, my dear," he breathed to himself, in an agony of love and self-restraint. But she did not hear the breath. She was engaged in a struggle of her own, and she seemed to remember that Hester girl, and know her duty. She must not let him see how she felt, not for anything in the world. He was kind and tender. He had always been. He had denied himself and come here to stay with them in their need because of his gratitude toward her father for all he had done for him. And he had breathed that dear as he would have done to any little child of the tenement whom he found in trouble. Oh, she understood, even while she let the word comfort her lonely heart. Why, oh why, had she been left to trifle with a handsome scoundrel? Why hadn't she been worthy to have won the love of a great man like this one? These thoughts rushed through her brain so rapidly that they were not formulated at all. Not until hours afterwards did she know they had been thought. But afterwards she sorted them out and put them in array before her troubled heart. A minute she struggled with her tears, and then in a sweet little voice, like a tired, naughty child, she broke out. "Oh, Michael, you've been so good to me. To us, I mean. Staying here all these weeks and not showing a bit of impatience when you had all that great work in the world to do. And I've just been thinking how perfectly horrid I was to you last winter. The things I said and wrote to you. And how I treated you when you were trying to save me from an awful fate. I'm so ashamed, and so thankful. It all came over me tonight what I owed you, and I can't ever thank you. Can you forgive me for the horrid way I acted, and for passing you on the street that Sunday without speaking to you? I'm so ashamed. Will you forgive me?" She put out her little hands with a pathetic motion toward him, in the half-light of the room, and he took them in both his great warm ones and held them in his firm grasp, his whole frame thrilling with her sweet touch. "Forgive you, little Star," he breathed. "I never blamed you." And there is no telling what might not have happened if the doctor had not just then unexpectedly arrived to perfect the arrangements for their going to the farm. When Michael returned from letting the doctor out, Star had fled upstairs to her room. When they met the next morning, it was with the bustle of preparation upon them, and each cast shy, smiling glances toward the other. Star knew that she was forgiven, but she also knew that there was a wall reared between them that had not been there before, and her heart ached with the knowledge. Nevertheless, it was a happy morning, and one could not be absolutely miserable in the company of Michael, with a father who was recovering rapidly, and the prospect of seeing him and going with him into the beautiful out-of-doors within a few hours. Michael went about the work of preparing to go with a look of solemn joy. Solemn because he felt that the wonderful companionship he had had alone with Star was so soon to end. Joyful because he could be with her still and know she had passed through the danger of the terrible disease and come safely out of the shadow with her beauty as vivid as ever. Besides, he might always serve her, and they were friends now, not enemies. That was a great deal. The little world of Old Orchard stood on tiptoe that lovely spring morning when the party came down. The winding road that led to the cottage was arched all over with bursting bloom, for the apple trees had done their best at decorating for the occasion, and made a wondrous canopy of pink and white for Star to see as she passed under. Not a soul was in sight as they drove up to the cottage, save Sam, standing respectfully to receive them in front of the piazza, and Lizzie, vanishing around the corner of the cottage with her pretty boy toddling after. For Lizzie had come down to be a waitress at Rose Cottage for the summer. But every soul on the farm was watching at a safe distance. For Sam, without breathing a word, had managed to convey to them all the knowledge that those who were coming as their guests were beloved of Michael, their angel-hearted man. As though it had been a great ceremony, they stood in silent, adoring groups behind a row of thick hedges and watched them arrive, each one glorying in the beauty of her whom in their hearts they called the boss's girl. The room stood wide and inviting to receive them. There was a fire of logs on the great hearth, and a deep leather chair drawn up before it, with a smaller rocker at one side, and a sumptuous leather couch for the invalid just to the side of the fireplace, where the light of the flames would not strike the eyes, yet the warmth would reach him. Soft greens and browns were blended in the silk pillows that were piled on the couch and on the seats that appeared here and there about the walls, as if they grew by nature. The bookcase was filled with Michael's favorites. Will French had seen to this, and a few were scattered on the big table where a green-shaded lamp of unique design, a freshly cut magazine, and a chair drawn at just the right angle suggested a pleasant hour in the evening. There were 2 or 3 pictures. These Michael had selected at intervals as he learned to know more about art from his study at the exhibitions. "Oh," breathed Star, "how lovely! It is a real home." And the thought struck her that it would probably be Michael's and Hester's some day. However, she would not let shadows come spoiling her good time now, for it was her good time, and she had a right to it. And she too was happy in the thought that she and Michael were friends, the kind of friends that can never be enemies again. The invalid sank into the cushions of the couch with a pleased light in his eyes and said, "Son, this is all right. I'm glad you bought the farm." And Michael turned with a look of love to the man who had been the only father he had ever known. It was good to be reconciled with him, and to know that he was on the road to health once more. The doctor who had come down with them looked about with satisfaction. "I don't see but you were fixed," he said to Endicott. "I wouldn't mind being in your shoes myself. Wish I could stay and help you enjoy yourself. If I had a pair of children like those, I'd give up work and come buy a farm alongside, and settle down for life." The days at the farm passed in a sort of charmed existence for Star and her father. Everything they needed seemed to come as if by magic. Every wish of Star's was anticipated, and she was waited upon devotedly by Lizzie, who never by so much as a look tried to win recognition. Star, however, always keen in her remembrances, knew and appreciated this. After the first 2 days, Michael was back and forth in the city. His business, which had been steadily growing before his temporary retirement from the world, had piled up and was awaiting his attention. His work in the alley called loudly for him every night, Yet he managed to come down to the farm often and spent all his Sundays there. It was one Saturday evening, about 3 weeks after their arrival at the farm, when they were all seated cozily in the living room of the cottage, the invalid resting on the couch in the shadow, Star seated close beside him, the firelight glowing on her face, her hand in her father's, and Michael by the table with a fresh magazine which he was about to read to them, that a knock came at the door. Opening the door, Michael found Sam standing on the piazza, and another dark form huddled behind him. "Come out here, can't you? Buck's here," whispered Sam. "Buck." Michael spoke the word with a joyful ring that thrilled Star's heart with sympathy as she sat listening, her ears alert with interest. "I'm so glad, said Michael's voice again, vibrant with real welcome. "Come in, Buck. I've a friend in here who knows all about you. No, don't be afraid. You're perfectly safe. What? Through the windows? Well, we'll turn the light out and sit in the firelight. You can go over in that corner by the fireplace. No one will see you. The shades are down." Michael's voice was low, and he stood within the doorway, but Star, because she understood the need, heard every word. There was dissent in a low whisper outside, and then Sam's voice growled, "Go on in, Buck, if he says so," and Buck reluctantly entered, followed by Sam. Buck was respectably dressed in an old suit of Sam's, with his hands and face carefully washed and his hair combed. Sam had imbibed ideas and was not slow to impart them. But Buck stood dark and frowning against the closed door. His hunted eyes, like black coals in a setting of snow, went furtively around the room in restless vigilance. His body wore the habitual air of crouching alertness. He started slightly when anyone moved or spoke to him. Michael went quickly over to the table and turned down the lamp. "You won't mind sitting in the firelight, will you?" he said to Star in a low tone, and her eyes told him that she understood. "Come over here, Buck," said Michael, motioning toward the sheltered corner on the other side of the fireplace from where Star was sitting. "This is one of my friends, Miss Endicott, Mr. Endicott. Will you excuse us if we sit here and talk a few minutes? Miss Endicott, you remember my telling you of Buck?" Star, with sudden inspiration born of the moment, got up and went over to where the dark-browed Buck stood frowning and embarrassed in the chimney corner, and put out her little rose-leaf of a hand to him. Buck looked at it in dismay and did not stir. "Why don't you shake?" whispered Sam. Then, with a grunt of astonishment, Buck put out his rough hand and underwent the unique experience of holding a lady's hand in his. The hunted eyes looked up startled to Star's, and like a flash he saw a thought. It was as if her eyes knew Browning's poem, and could express his thought to Buck in language he could understand. "All I could never be, all men ignored in me. This I was worth to God, whose wheel the pitcher shaped." Somehow Star, with her smile in her eyes, and her gentle manner, unknowingly conveyed that thought to Buck. Poor, neglected, sinful Buck. And Michael, looking on, knew what she had done, and blessed her in his heart. Buck sat down in the chimney corner, half in shadow with the lights from the great log flaring over his face. The shades were all drawn down, the doors were closed. He was surrounded by friendly faces. For a few minutes the hunted eyes ceased their roving round the room, and rested on Star's sweet face as she sat quietly, holding her father's hand. It was a sight such as poor Buck's eyes had never rested upon in the whole of his checkered existence, and for the moment he let the sweet wonder of it filter into his dark, scarred soul, with blessed healing. Then he looked from Star to Michael's fine face near by, tender with the joy of Buck's coming, anxious with what might be the outcome. And for a moment the heavy lines in forehead and brow that Buck had worn since babyhood softened with a tender look. Perhaps 'tis given once to even the dullest soul to see, no matter how low fallen, just what he might have been. They had been sitting thus for about 15 minutes, quietly talking. Michael intended to take Buck upstairs soon and question him, but first he wanted time to think what he must do. Then suddenly a loud knock startled them all, and as Michael rose to go to the door, there followed him the resounding clatter of the tongs falling on the hearth. A voice with a knife edge to it cut through the room and made them all shiver. "Good evening, Mr. Endicott," it said. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I've come on a most unpleasant errand. We're after an escaped criminal, and he was seen to enter your door a few minutes ago. Of course I know your goodness of heart. You take 'em all in, but this one is a jailbird. You'll excuse me if I take him off your hands. I'll try to do it as quietly and neatly as possible." The big, blustery voice ceased, and Michael, looking at the sinister gleam of dull metal in the hands of the men who accompanied the county sheriff, knew that the crisis was upon him. The man, impatient, was already pushing past him into the room. It was of no sort of use to resist. He flung the door wide and turned with the saddest look Starr thought she had ever seen on the face of a man. "I know," he said, and his voice was filled with sorrow. "I know, but he was one whom I loved." "Wasted love, Mr. Endicott, wasted love. Not one of 'em worth it," blustered the big man, walking in. Then Michael turned and faced the group around the fireplace, and looking from one to another turned white with amazement, for Buck was not among them. Starr sat beside her father in just the same attitude she had held throughout the last 15 minutes, his hand in hers, her face turned, startled, toward the door, and something inscrutable in her eyes. Sam stood close beside the fireplace, the tongs which he had just picked up in his hands, and a look of sullen rage upon his face. Nowhere in the whole wide room was there a sign of Buck, and there seemed no spot where he could hide. The door into the dining room was on the opposite wall, and behind it the cheerful clatter of the clearing off of the table could be plainly heard. If Buck had escaped that way, there would have been an outcry from Morton or the maid. Every window had its shade closely drawn. The sheriff looked suspiciously at Michael, whose blank face plainly showed he had no part in making way with the outlaw. The men behind him looked sharply round, and finished with a curious gaze at Starr. Starr, rightly interpreting the scene, rose to the occasion. "Would they like to look behind this couch?" she said, moving quickly to the other side of the fireplace over toward the window, with a warning glance toward Sam. Then, while the men began a fruitless search around the room, looking in the chimney closet and behind the furniture, she took up her stand beside the corner window. It had been Michael's thoughtfulness that had arranged that all the windows should have springs worked by the pressing of a button, like some car windows, so that a touch would send them up at will. Only Sam saw Starr's hand slide under the curtain a second, and unfasten the catch at the top, then quickly down and touch the button in the windowsill. The window went up without a noise, and in a moment more the curtain was moving out, gently puffed by the soft spring breeze, and Starr had gone back to her father's side. "I cannot understand it," said Michael. "He was here a moment ago." The sheriff, who had been nosing about the fireplace, turned and came over to the window, sliding up the shade with a motion and looking out into the dark orchard. That's where he went, boys," he said. "After him, quick. We ought to have had a watch at each window as well as at the back. Thank you, Mr. Endicott. Sorry to have troubled you. Good night." And the sheriff clattered after his men. Sam quickly pulled down the window, fastening it, and turned a look of almost worshipful understanding on Starr. "Isn't that fire getting pretty hot for such a warm night?" said Starr, pushing back the hair from her forehead and bright cheeks. "Sam, suppose you get a little water and pour over that log. I think we will not need any more fire tonight, anyway." And Sam quickly hastened to obey, his mouth stretching in a broad grin as he went out the door. "She'd make a peach of a burglar," he remarked to himself, as he filled a bucket with water and hurried back with it to the fire. Michael, in his strait betwixt law and love, was deeply troubled, and had followed the men out into the dark orchard. "Daddy, I think you better get up to your room. This excitement has been too much for you," said Starr decidedly. But Mr. Endicott demurred. He had been interested in the little drama that had been enacted before him, and he wanted to sit up and see the end of it. He was inclined to blame Michael for bringing such a fellow into Star's presence. But Star laughingly bundled him off to bed, and sat for an hour reading to him, her heart all the time in a flutter to know how things came out, wondering if Sam surely understood, and put out the fire, and if it would be safe for her to give him any broader hint. At midnight, Michael lay broad awake with troubled spirit, wondering over and over if there was anything he might have done for Buck if he had only done it in time, anything that would have been right to do. Softly, cautiously, a man stole out of the darkness of the orchard until he came and stood close to the old chimney. And then, softly stealing on the midnight summer air, there came a peculiar sibilant sound, clear, piercing, yet blending with the night, and leaving no trace behind of its origin. One couldn't tell from whence it came. But Michael, keeping vigil, heard, and rose upon his elbow, alert, listening. Was that Buck calling him? It came again, softer this time, but distinct. Michael sprang from his bed and began hastily throwing on his garments. That call should never go unanswered. Stealthily, in the light of the low, late moon, a dark figure stole forth from the old chimney-top, climbed down on the ladder that had been silently tilted against it, helped to lay the ladder back innocently in the deep grass again, and joining the figure on the ground, crept away toward the river where waited a boat. Buck lay down in the bottom of the boat, covered with a piece of sacking, and Sam took up the oars, when a long, sibilant whistle like a night bird floated keenly through the air. Buck started up and turned suspicious eyes on Sam. "What's that?" "It's Mickey, I reckon," said Sam, softly, reverently. "You couldn't sleep. He's hunting you." Buck lay down with a sound that was almost a moan, and the boat took up its silent glide toward safety. "It's fierce to leave him this way," muttered Buck. "You's tell him, won't you? And her, she's a lady, she is. She's all white. Tell her Buck'll do as much for her some day if he ever gets the chance." "And doin' for her you'd be doin' for him, I speculate," said Sam, after a long pause. "So?" said Buck. "So," answered Sam. And that was the way Sam told Buck of the identity of Star. Now Star, from her darkened window beside the great chimney, had watched the whole thing. She waited until she saw Michael come slowly, sadly back from his fruitless search through the mist before the dawning, alone, with bowed head, and her heart ached for the problem that was filling him with sorrow. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 28. Star was coming up to the city for a little shopping on the early morning train with Michael. The summer was almost upon her, and she had not prepared her apparel. Besides, she was going away in a few days to be bridesmaid at the wedding of an old school friend who lived away out west. And secretly she told herself she wanted the pleasure of this little trip to town with Michael. She was treasuring every one of these beautiful days filled with precious experiences, like jewels to be strung on memory's chain, with a vague unrest lest some close drawing future was to snatch them from her forever. She wished with all her heart that she had given a decided refusal to her friend's pleading. But the friend had put off the wedding on her account to wait until she could leave her father. And her father had joined his insistence that she should go away and have the rest and change after the ordeal of the winter. So Star seemed to have to go, much as she would rather have remained. She had made a secret vow to herself that she would return at once after the wedding, in spite of all urgings to remain with the family who had invited her to stay all summer with them. Star had a feeling that the days of her companionship with Michael might be short. She must make the most of them. It might never be the same again after her going away. She was not sure even that her father would consent to remain all summer at the farm, as Michael urged. And on this lovely morning she was very happy at the thought of going with Michael. The sea seemed sparkling with 1,000 gems as the train swept along its shore. And Michael told her of his first coming down to see the farm, called her attention to the flowers along the way, and she assured him Old Orchard was far prettier than any of them, now that the roses were all beginning to bud. It would soon be Rose Cottage indeed. Then the talk fell on Buck and his brief passing. "I wonder where he can be, and what he is doing," sighed Michael. "If he only could have stayed long enough for me to have a talk with him. I believe I could have persuaded him to a better way. It is the greatest mystery in the world how he got away with those men watching the house. I cannot understand it." Star, her cheeks rosy, her eyes shining mischievously, looked up at him. "Haven't you the least suspicion where he was hiding?" she asked. Michael looked down at her with a sudden start, and smiled into her lovely eyes. "Why, no. Have you?" he said, and could not keep the worship from his gaze. "Of course. I knew all the time. Do you think it was very dreadful for me not to tell? I couldn't bear to have him caught that way before you'd had a chance to help him, and when he used to be so good to you as a little boy. Besides, I saw his face, that terrible, hunted look. There wasn't anything really wrong in my opening that window and throwing them off the track, was there?" "Did you open the window?" Star nodded saucily. "Yes, and Sam saw me do it. Sam knew all about it. Buck went up the chimney right through that hot fire. Didn't you hear the tongs fall down? He went like a flash before you opened the door, and one foot was still in sight when that sheriff came in. I was so afraid he'd see it. Was it wrong?" "I suppose it was," he said, sadly. "The law must be maintained. It can't be set aside for one fellow who has touched one's heart by some childhood's action. But right or wrong, I can't help being glad that you cared to do something for poor Buck." "I think I did it mostly for you," she said softly, her eyes still down. For answer, Michael reached out his hand and took her little gloved one that lay in her lap in a close pressure for just an instant. Then, as if a mighty power were forcing him, he laid it gently down again and drew his hand away. Star felt the pressure of that strong hand and the message that it gave through long days afterward, and more than once it gave her strength and courage and good cheer. Come what might, she had a friend strong and true as an angel. They spoke no more till the train swept into the station, and they had hurried through the crowd and were standing on the front of the ferry boat, with the water sparkling before their onward gliding, and the whole great, wicked, stirring city spread before their gaze, the light from the cross on Trinity Church steeple flinging its glory in their faces. "Look," said Michael, pointing. "Do you remember the poem we were reading the other night? Wordsworth's Upon Westminster Bridge. Doesn't it fit this scene perfectly? I've often thought of it when I was coming across in the mornings. To look over there at the beauty, one would never dream of all the horror and wickedness and suffering that lies within those streets. It is beautiful now. Listen. Do you remember it? Earth has not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. This city now doth like a garment wear the beauty of the morning. Silent, bare. Ships, towers, domes, theaters, and temples lie open unto the fields and to the sky, all bright and glittering in the smokeless air. Never did sun more beautifully steep in his first splendor valley, rock, or hill. Ne'er saw I, never felt a calm so deep. The river glideth at its own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep, and all that mighty heart is lying still." Star looked long at the picture before her, and then at the face of her companion, speaking the beautiful lines, word by word, as one draws in the outlines of a well-loved picture. Michael's hat was off, and the beauty of the morning lay in sunlight on his hair and cheek and brow. Her heart swelled within her as she looked, and great tears filled her eyes. She dared not look longer, lest she show her deep emotion. The look of him, the words he spoke, and the whole wonderful scene would linger in her memory as long as life should last. 2 days later, Star started west, and life seemed empty for Michael. She was gone from him, but still she would come back. Or would she come back after all? How long could he hope to keep her if she did? Sad foreboding filled him, and he went about his work with set, strained nerves. For now he knew that, right or wrong, she was heart of his heart, part of his consciousness. He loved her better than himself, and he saw no hope for himself at all in trying to forget. Yet never, never would he ask her to share the dishonor of his heritage. The day before Star was expected to come back to Old Orchard, Michael took up the morning paper, and with rising horror read, "Bandit wounded as 4 hold up train. Express messenger protects cash during desperate revolver duel in car. Fort Smith, Arkansas. 4 bandits bungled the holdup of a Kansas City passenger train between Hatfield and Mena, Arkansas, early today. One was probably fatally wounded and captured, and the others escaped after a battle with the express messenger, in which the messenger exhausted his ammunition and was badly beaten. When the other robbers escaped, the wounded bandit eluded the conductor and made his way into the sleeper, where he climbed into an empty berth. But he was soon traced by the drops of blood from his wound. The conductor and a brakeman hauled him out and battled with him in the aisle amid the screams of passengers. The bandit aimed his revolver at the conductor and fired, but a sudden unsteady turn of his wrist sent the bullet into himself instead of the conductor. The wounded bandit received the bullet in his left breast near the heart and will probably die. The express messenger is in the hospital at Mena and may recover. Had the bullet of the bandit gone as intended, it would more than likely have wounded 1 or 2 women passengers, who, at the sound of trouble, had jumped from their berths into the aisle and were directly in the path of the bullet. There is some likelihood that the captured bandit may prove to be the escaped convict named Buck, who was serving long sentence in the state penitentiary, and for whom the police have been searching in vain for the last 3 months. Michael was white and trembling when he had finished reading this account. And was this then to be the end of Buck? Must he die a death like that? Disgrace and sin and death, and no chance to make good? Michael groaned aloud and bowed his head upon the table before him, his heart too heavy even to try to think it out. That evening a telegram reached him from Arkansas. A man named Buck is dying here, and calls incessantly for you. If you wish to see him alive, come at once. Michael took the midnight train. Star had telegraphed her father she would reach Old Orchard in the morning. It was hard to have to go when she was just returning. Michael wondered if it would always be so now. Buck roused at Michael's coming and smiled feebly. "Mickey, I knowed you'd come," he whispered feebly. "I'm done for, partner. I ain't long for here, but I couldn't go without you knowin'. I'd meant to get just this one haul and get away to some other country where it was safe. Then I was going to try and keep straight like you would want. I would have got through all right, but I seen her. The pretty lady. Your girl. Standing in the aisle, right behind the conductor. Just as I was pulling the trigger, knowed her right off, with her eyes shining like 2 stars. And I couldn't run no risks. I ain't never been no bungler at my trade, but I had to bungle this time, 'cause I couldn't shoot your girl. So I turned it just in time, and took it myself. She seen how 'twas with me that time at your house, and she helped me get away. I sent her word I'd do the same for her someday. Bless her. And now, you tell her we're square. I done the bungling for her sake, but I done it for you too, pard. Little pard. Mickey." "Oh, Buck." Michael knelt beside the poor bed and buried his face in the coverlet. "Oh, Buck, if you'd only had my chance," he moaned. "Never you mind, Mickey. I ain't squealing. I knows how to take my dose. And maybe there'll be some kind of a college where I'm going, and I can get a try at yet. Don't you fret, little pard.
If I get my chance, I'll take it, for your sake."
The life breath seemed to be spent with the effort, and Buck sank slowly into unconsciousness, and so passed out of a life that had been all against him. Michael, after doing all the last little things that were permitted him, sadly took his way home again. He reached the city in the morning and spent several hours putting to rights his business affairs. But by noon he found himself so unutterably weary that he took the 2 o'clock train down to the farm. Sam met him at the station. Sam somehow seemed to have an intuition when to meet him, and the two gripped hands and walked home together across the salt grass, Michael telling in low, halting tones all that Buck had said. Sam kept his face turned the other way, but once Michael got a view of it, and he was sure there were tears on his cheeks. To think of Sam having tears for anything. Arrived at the cottage, Sam told him he thought that Mr. Endicott was taking his afternoon nap upstairs, and that Miss Endicott had gone to ride with some kind of a fancy woman in an auto, who had called to see her. Being very weary and yet unwilling to run the risk of waking Mr. Endicott by going upstairs, Michael asked Sam to bolt the dining-room door and give orders that he should not be disturbed for an hour. Then he lay down on the leather couch in the living-room. The windows were open all around, and the sweet breath of the opening roses stole in with the summer breeze, while the drone of bees and the pure notes of a song sparrow lulled him to sleep. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Brian Keenan. Chapter 29. Michael had slept perhaps an hour when he was roused by the sound of voices, a sharp, hateful one with an unpleasant memory in it, and a sweet, dear one that went to his very soul. "Sit down here, Aunt Frances. There is no one about. Papa is asleep, and Michael has not yet returned from a trip out west. You can talk without fear of being heard." "Michael, Michael," sniffed the voice. "Well, that's what I came to talk to you about. I didn't want to say anything out there where the chauffeur could hear. He is altogether too curious and might talk with the servants about it. I wouldn't have it get out for the world. Your mother would have been mortified to death about all this, and I can't see what your father is thinking about. He never did seem to have much sense where you were concerned." "Aunt Frances." "Well, I can't help it. He doesn't. Now take this matter of your being down here, and the very thought of your calling that fellow Michael, as if you were a cousin or something. Why, it's simply disgusting. I hoped you were going to stay out west until your father was well enough to go away somewhere with you. But now that you have come back, I think you ought to leave here at once. People will begin to talk, and I don't like it. Why, the fellow will be presuming on it to be intimate with you." Michael was suddenly roused to the fact that he was listening to a conversation not intended for his ears, and yet he had no way of getting out of hearing without passing the door, in the front of which the two women were seated. Both the dining-room door and the stairs were on the other side of the room from him, and he would have to run the risk of being seen, by either or both of them, if he attempted to cross to them. The windows were screened by wire nailed over the whole length, so he could not hope to get successfully out of any of them. There was nothing for it but to lie still, and pretend to be asleep if they discovered him afterwards. It was an embarrassing situation, but it was none of his choosing. There was a slight stir outside. Star had risen, and was standing with her back to the doorway. "Aunt Frances, what do you mean? Michael is our honored and respected friend, our protector, our host. Think what he did for Papa. Risked his life." "Stuff and nonsense. Risked his life. He took the risk for perfectly good reasons. He knew how to worm himself into the family again." "Aunt Frances, I will not hear you say such dreadful things. Michael is a gentleman, well educated, with the highest ideals and principles. If you knew how self-sacrificing and kind he is." "Kind, yes, kind," sniffed the aunt. "And what will you think about it when he asks you to marry him? Will you think he is kind to offer you a share in the inheritance of a nobody, a charity, dependent, a child of the slums? If you persist in your foolishness of staying here, you will presently have all New York gossiping about you, and then, when you are in disgrace, I suppose you will turn to me to help you out of it." "Stop," cried Star. "I will not listen to another word. What do you mean by disgrace? There could be no disgrace in marrying Michael. The girl who marries him will be the happiest woman in the whole world. He is good and true and unselfish to the heart's core. There isn't the slightest danger of his ever asking me to marry him, Aunt Frances, because I am very sure he loves another girl and is engaged to marry her, and she is a nice girl, too. But if it were different, if he were free and asked me to marry him, I would feel as proud and glad as if a prince of the highest realm had asked me to share his throne with him. I would rather marry Michael than any man I ever met, and I don't care in the least whether he is a child of the slums or a child of a king. I know what he is, and he is a prince among men." "Oh, really, has it come to this? Then you are in love with him already, and my warning comes too late, does it? Answer me. Do you fancy yourself in love with him?" "Aunt Frances, you have no right to ask me that question," said Star steadily, her cheeks very red, and her eyes very bright. Michael was sitting bolt upright on the couch now, utterly forgetful of the dishonor of eavesdropping, fairly holding his breath to listen, and straining his ears that he might lose no slightest word. He was devouring the dear, straight little form in the doorway with his eyes, and her every word fell on his tired heart like raindrops in a thirsty land, making the flowers of hope spring forth and burst into lovely bloom. "Well, I do ask it," snapped the aunt, hatefully. "Come, answer me. Do you love him?" "That, Aunt Frances, I shall never answer to anybody but Michael. I must refuse to hear another word on this subject." "Oh, very well, goodbye. I'll leave you to your silly fate, but don't expect me to help you out of trouble if you get into it. I've warned you, and I wash my hands of you." And the angry woman flouted out to her waiting car. But the girl stood still in the doorway and said with dignity, "Good afternoon, Aunt Frances. I shall never ask your help in any way." Star watched the car out of sight, great tears welling into her eyes and rolling down her cheeks. Michael sat breathless on the couch and tried to think what he ought to do, while his very being was rippling with the joy of the words she had spoken. Then she turned and saw him, and he stood up and held out his arms. "Star, my little Star, my darling, did you mean all you said? Would you really marry me? I've loved you always, Star, since first I saw you a tiny little child. I've loved your soft baby kisses, and those others you gave me later when you were a little girl, and I an awkward boy. You never knew how dear they were, nor how I used to go to sleep at night dreaming over and over again those kisses on my face. Oh, Star, answer me. Did you mean it all? And could you ever love me? You said you would answer that question to no one else but me. Will you answer it now, darling?" For answer she came and stood within his arms, her eyes down drooped, her face all tears and smiles, and he folded her within his strong clasp and stooping, whispered softly, "Star, little darling, my life, my love, my wife." And then he laid his lips against hers and held her close. 3 weeks later, when the roses were all a burst of bloom over the porch at Rose Cottage, and June was everywhere with her richness and perfection of beauty, Star and Michael were married on the piazza under an arch of roses, and a favored few of society's cream motored down to Old Orchard to witness the ceremony. In spite of all her disagreeable predictions and ugly threats, Aunt Frances was among them, smiling and dominating. "Yes, so sensible of her not to make a fuss with her wedding just now, when her father is getting his strength back again. Of course she could have come to my house and been married. I begged her to. Naturally she shrank from another wedding in connection with the old home, you know. But her father seemed to dread coming into town, and so I advised her to go ahead and be married here. Isn't it a charming place? So rustic, you know, and quite simple and artistic, too, in its way. Michael has done it all, planned the house and everything, of course with Star's help. You know it's quite a large estate, belonged to Michael's great-grandfather once, several hundred acres, and he has used part of it for charitable purposes. Has a farm school or something for poor slum people, and is really teaching them to be quite decent. I'm sure I hope they'll be duly grateful. See those roses? Aren't they perfectly dear?" It was so she chattered to those in the car with her all the way down to the farm. And to see her going about among the guests and smiling and posing to Michael when he happened to come near her, you would have thought the match all of her making, and never have dreamed that it was only because Michael's great forgiving heart had said, "Oh, forgive her and ask her down. She is your mother's sister, you know, and you'll be glad you did it afterwards. Never mind what she says. She can't help her notions. It was her unfortunate upbringing, and she's as much to be pitied as I for my slum education." The pretty ceremony under the roses was over, and Star had gone upstairs to change the simple embroidered muslin for her traveling frock and motor coat. For Michael and Star were to take their honeymoon in their own new car, a wedding gift from their father, and Endicott himself was to go to his sister's by rail in the company of Will French, to stay during their absence and be picked up by them on their homeward route. Michael stood among his friends on the piazza, giving last directions to French, who was to look after his law business also during his absence, and who was eager to tell his friend how he and Hester had planned to be married early in the fall, and were to go to housekeeping in a 5-roomed flat that might have been a palace from the light in Will's eyes. Hester was talking with Lizzie, who had edged near the porch, with her pretty boy hiding shyly behind her. But the smile that Hester threw in Will's direction now and then showed she well knew what was his subject of conversation. All the little colony had been gathered in the orchard in front of the Rose Arch to watch the wedding ceremony, and many of them still lingered there to see the departure of the beloved bride and groom. Aunt Frances leveled her lorgnette at them with all the airs of her departed sister, and exclaimed, "Aren't they picturesque? It's quite like the old country to have so many servants and retainers gathered about adoring, now isn't it?" And a young and eager debutante, who was a distant cousin of Star's, replied, "I think it's perfectly peachy, Aunt Frances." Suddenly, in one of Will's eager perorations about the flat and its outlook, Michael noticed the shy, eager look of Sam's face, as he waited hungrily for notice. "Excuse me, Will, I must see Sam a minute," said Michael, hurrying over to where the man stood. "Say, Mickey," said Sam shyly, grasping Michael's hand convulsively. "Me and Lizzie sorta made it up as how we'd get tied, and we thought we'd do it now whilst everybody's at it and things is all fixed. Lizzie she wanted me to ask you if you supposed she'd mind if we and stood there on the verandy where you stood after you was gone?" Sam looked at him anxiously, as though he had asked the half of Michael's kingdom and scarcely expected to get it. But Michael's face was filled with glory as he clasped the small, hard hand of his comrade and gripped it with his mighty, hearty grip. "Mind? She'd be delighted, Sam. Go ahead. I'm sorry we didn't know it before. We'd have liked to give you a present, but I'll send you the deed of the little white cottage at the head of the lane, the one that looks toward the river and the sunset, you know. Will you two like to live there?" Sam's eyes grew large with happiness, and a mist came over them as he held tight to the great hand that enclosed his own, and choked and tried to answer. Amid a shower of roses and cheers, Michael and Star rode into the sweet June afternoon, alone together at last. And when they had gone beyond the little town, and were on a stretch of quiet woodsy road, Michael stopped the car and took his bride into his arms. "Dear," he said, as he tenderly kissed her, "I've just been realizing what might have happened if Buck hadn't seen you in time and taken the shot himself, that I might have you. My life. My dear, precious wife." Then Star looked up with her eyes all dewy with tears and said, "Michael, we must try to save a lot of others for his sake." And Michael smiled and pressed his lips to hers again, with deep, sweet understanding. Then when they were riding along again, Michael told her of what Sam had asked, and how another wedding was to follow theirs. "Oh, Michael," said Star, all eagerness at once, "why didn't you tell me sooner? I would have liked to stay and see them married.
Couldn't we turn around now and get there in time if you put on high speed?" "We'll try," said Michael, reversing the car. And in an instant more it was shooting back to Old Orchard, arriving on the scene just as Sam and Lizzie were shyly taking their place, hand in hand, under the roses, in as near imitation of Michael and Star as their unaccustomedness could compass. It was Jim who discovered the car coming up the orchard lane. "For de lub of Mike," he exclaimed aloud, "if here don't come Mickey hisse'f, and her! Hold up dar, Mr. Preacher, don't tie de knot till they gets here." And a cheer arose loud and long, and echoed through the trees and over the river to the sea. 3 cheers for the love of Michael. Sam and Lizzie bloomed forth with smiles, and the ceremony went forward with alacrity now that the real audience was present. An hour later, having done their part to make the wedding festivities as joyous as their own had been, Michael and Star started out again into the waning day, a light on their faces and joy in their hearts. Star, her heart very full, laid her hand upon Michael's and said with shining eyes, "Michael, do you know, I found a name for you. Listen. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Michael, you are my prince." And Michael, as he stooped and kissed her, murmured, "My Star." End of chapter 29. End of Lo, Michael by Grace Livingston Hill.